Good morning and good day. Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear. The first story, The Cold That Watches. My name is Travis Carter, and today I will tell you a true story I heard from my father, John Carter. The wind was bone-chilling, the tent was ripping apart from the gale, and the melody of that very wind sounded like a funeral dirge. But the real horror began with the silence that came after the storm. It was May 1992, Denali Mountain, Alaska, altitude 17,400 feet, the camp of 4. There had been 8 of them when they began the ascent. Now only 4 remained, entombed in a hand-dug snow cave in the slope, their only shelter from a 6-day hurricane that had hit the mountain with the fury of a biblical flood. The radio had long fallen silent, choked by static. The fuel for the stove ran out yesterday. The last crumb of chocolate was shared 3 days ago. The air in the cave was thick, stifling, poisoned by carbon dioxide and the smell of fear. "He's watching me," whispered Lex, the young photographer, his voice as dry as the crack of ice. His fingers, wrapped in dirty cloth, picked mindlessly at the cave wall. "Who?" Beck asked hoarsely, the most experienced among them. He sat with his head tucked into his shoulders, trying to preserve the last remnants of warmth. His face, frost-bitten and blackened, resembled a mask. He was nearly blind from corneal edema caused by altitude sickness, and the world was a blurry grey smear. To him, the one outside, Lex turned his gaunt, bearded face toward them. His eyes, unnaturally shiny, were wide open. "He walks around, listens. He was waiting for the storm to weaken us." "It's the wind, Lex," Sarah, the expedition's doctor, said wearily. Her rational mind clung to the last straws of logic, but her own nerves were stretched taut like strings. "Just the wind driving snow across the slope. Calm down. Save your strength." "The wind doesn't breathe like that," Lex whispered stubbornly. "And the wind doesn't have a voice like that. It whispers." Their fourth companion, Mike, was silent. He lay curled up in the farthest corner of the cave, turned toward the wall. He hadn't moved for several hours. Beck struggled to his feet, his joints creaking from the cold. He crawled over to Mike and shook his shoulder. "Mike?" "Hey, buddy, how are you?" Silence was the only answer. Beck brought his nearly sightless face close to Mike's. Not a sound of breath came from Mike's chest. His skin felt cold and waxy to the touch. "He's—" Beck began but didn't finish. At that moment, Mike's head snapped around. His eyes were open, but there was nothing human in them. Only a flat, glassy blackness like that of a deep-sea fish. His lips, chapped from the frost, twitched, and a sound erupted from his throat that was impossible to produce with human vocal cords. It was the grinding of ice against ice, the whistle of a blizzard in crevasses, the low, vibrational hum of the mountain itself. "Here. It's warm." Something hissed through Mike's mouth. Lex screamed and scrambled toward the exit. Sarah stood frozen in stupefaction. The scalpel of her medical knowledge was useless against this. Beck, driven by a blind instinct, recoiled. The creature wearing Mike's body slowly, with a nightmarish mechanical smoothness, rose. It didn't bend its knees. It simply hovered a few centimeters above the cave floor, its feet dragging through the snow. "Hungry." The same icy whisper sounded, filling the cave with the smell of permafrost and stone. It moved toward Sarah. She stood paralyzed with terror, unable to make a sound. The creature reached out a hand and touched her cheek. Where the frost-bitten fingers touched her skin, no white spot was left. The skin instantly blackened and charred, as if touched by liquid nitrogen. Sarah didn't scream. She simply exhaled the air from her lungs in a silent gasp, and her eyes rolled back, leaving only the whites. "Run!" Beck shouted, grabbing Lex by the jacket and shoving him out of the cave into the dazzling, merciless whiteness of the day. They ran, stumbling, falling into the deep snow, not choosing a path. Beck's blindness became their curse and their salvation. He couldn't see where he was running. He was just running from there. Lex, leading him, constantly looked back, his face distorted by panic. "It didn't come out. It's not following us," he exhaled, stopping to catch his breath. They were on an open slope. The wind had died down. The sun was blinding. It seemed they were saved, but the silence was even more terrifying than the storm. It was unnatural, oppressive, full of anticipation. And then they heard it. Not a whisper, but singing. It didn't come from behind, from the cave. It poured from above, from the very summit, and from below, from the glacial crevasses, and from inside their own skulls. It was an ancient pre-human melody, full of longing for a warmth it had never known. A melody that promised only eternal cold and the peace of oblivion. "It's not chasing us because we already belong to it," Lex realized in horror. "It has herded us into a trap. We're on the playing field, and it is the hunter." Their minds began to surrender. Hallucinations caused by altitude, hunger, and fear intertwined with the freezing reality. In the sun-glittering snow crystals, they saw faces. In the whistle of the wind, those very whispering voices. "Come to us. Become part of the whole. Shed the burden of warmth." Lex couldn't take it. He screamed, covered his ears with his hands, and ran downhill toward a visible, gentle saddle in the distance that seemed like salvation. "Stop! There's a crevasse there!" Beck shouted blindly, but it was too late. He heard a short cry, the sound of a fall, and then silence. Lex was gone, swallowed by the blue abyss of a glacial rift, its mouth skillfully disguised by fresh snow. Beck was alone, blind, lonely, in the center of a white hell. The cold squeezed his chest in a steel vice. He understood this wasn't just freezing. It was trying to get inside, to squeeze out the last drops of life from him, to take his warmth, his soul, to add to its collection. He collapsed into the snow, his strength leaving him. Consciousness was fading. In the last moments of clarity, he felt something approaching, not with steps, but with a sliding motion. A cold shadow fell over him. "Sleep," whispered the familiar icy voice right at his ear. "Your warmth is mine, now." Beck lost consciousness. He lay like that for several hours. His body was freezing, his life processes nearly halted. To any observer, he was dead. That's exactly how two survivors from another group found him, stumbling upon him on their way down. They saw a blackened, ice-crusted body and, taking pity, covered it with the remains of a sleeping bag, marking the spot with a pole. They couldn't carry him with them. They left him, as the dead are left, but it didn't take him completely. It only sampled him. It left a part of its cold inside him, its mark. When the people left, Beck's consciousness began to break through the thickness of ice and nothingness. It wasn't the will to life that lifted him from the abyss. It was pushing him out. The thing that had taken root in him couldn't stand stillness. It was bored. It needed new toys, new warmth. And down below, in the camp at 14,000 feet, lights were burning. There was life. And Beck stood up. His movements were unnaturally smooth, precise. He didn't stumble over wind-packed snow, didn't sink into the powder. He glided over it. His blindness was no obstacle. He saw the world differently. He saw thermal traces, the beating of hearts in the distance, fear like a bright flash in the cold darkness of the world. An ancient instinct, not his own, guided him down toward prey. He reached the camp like a ghost emerging from a blizzard. His appearance was a miracle that quickly turned into a nightmare. They laid him in a tent, tried to warm him up, gave him tea, but those who were closest to him noticed oddities. His skin remained burning cold. His breath didn't fog in the frost, and his eyes, if anyone looked into them too deeply, they glimpsed that same bottomless, glassy blackness in their depths. And then people in the camp started to disappear. First, the one who was on radio duty at night. He was found in the morning in a snowdrift, frozen to death at -20, with an expression of silent horror on his face and with absolutely black, icy fingers. Then the girl who had shared her tea with Beck disappeared. She was found in a glacial crevasse. Her body was as cold as if she had been lying there for weeks, not hours. Panic settled in the camp. They realized something was wrong. That rescue had brought death with it. By the time the heroic National Guard helicopter, risking their lives, broke through the fierce wind for evacuation, a quiet hysteria reigned in the camp. Beck, wrapped in a sleeping bag, was loaded on board. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, one of the pilots turned to check on the rescued man. Beck lay motionless, but from the folds of the sleeping bag, his hand was visible. And the pilot saw the fingers on that hand slowly, almost caressingly, tracing the metal skin of the cabin. And where they touched the steel, frost instantly appeared, followed by a web of the finest cracks, as if the metal had instantly frozen to brittleness. The pilot froze, looking out the porthole at the retreating white massif of Denali, and he fancied that the entire mountain was not just a pile of rocks and ice, that it was one huge, sleeping body, and that they had just taken away with them its tiniest, yet most greedy and dangerous particle, a particle that was now flying into a warm, densely populated world, full of such desirable, such generous warmth. And the silence in the helicopter cabin suddenly seemed to him the loudest and most ominous thing in the world. The second story, Depths That Call by Name. My name is Taylor. This story happened to my father. It's very difficult for me to remember that fateful year of 1989. A dull, deafening impact against rock reverberated through the entire hull of the ship, from the keel to the mastheads. The steel giant, the tanker MV Malaspina, shuddered with its entire 200-meter body, froze for an instant, and then let out a groan, a drawn-out, metallic, deathly groan. And it was immediately drowned out by an all-consuming silence. The electricity went out. The hum of the engines, the hiss of steam pipes, the voices on the radio fell silent. Only the furious howl of the wind outside remained, and an alarming growing rumble somewhere below, in the bowels of the ship. Captain Elijah Vargas froze in the complete darkness of his bridge, his fingers gripping the cold steel of the helm. Through the snow-blinded portholes, nothing was visible but murky, swirling darkness. That very roar that had come from under the hull was familiar to him. He had heard it only once in his life, 40 years ago, when his first ship ran aground. On a reef near the Aleutian Islands, the sound of rock tearing through steel. "Everyone remain at your posts. Report damage." His voice, accustomed to command, sounded hoarse and unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. In response, the ticking of a clock and the screech of ice floes against the hull. The radio was dead. The emergency generator didn't start. The bridge door flew open, letting in a whirlwind of icy air and the first mate, Miles. His face, illuminated by the flickering light of an emergency flashlight, was as white as the snow overboard. "Captain, we hit something. Tanks 2 and 3. They're filling up. Fast. Water is flooding the engine room." "Underwater rocks," Vargas whispered. "They shouldn't be here. They're not on the charts." "Captain," Miles's voice trembled. "Down. There. Below. There's another sound. Doesn't sound like water." Before Vargas could answer, the ship shuddered again, listing to port. A glass partition cracked. Somewhere deep in the hull, a deafening crash sounded, equipment breaking loose from its mounts. And through all this chaos, barely audible but all the more terrifying for it, came that other sound. Not just the roar of water rushing into the compartments. It was a grinding, metal on metal. No, more like the grinding of many claws, scraping from the inside against the bulkheads, trying to break out. The Malaspina slowly, inexorably leaned on its side, turning into an icy tomb for 37 men. The crew rushed to the lifeboats, but lowering them into the raging sea with such a list was impossible. One of the boats, breaking free from its davits, crashed into the black water and instantly disappeared into the foam and snow-churned abyss. "To the hold, everyone to the cargo hold." "It's the highest point," Vargas commanded. Understanding it was their last chance. The flight through the corridors, which had turned into icy, slippery pipes, was like a nightmare. The walls wept with frost. Icy steam shot out of the ventilation grates, and that sound, it grew louder. Now it wasn't just grinding. It was something like a whisper. Many voices merging into one icy, soulless hum coming from behind the steel walls. "Do you hear that?" shouted a young sailor named Jack, stopping and pressing his palms to his ears. "They're calling my name. They know my name." His comrade shoved him roughly forward. "Move. It's the wind in the pipes, or a hallucination from the cold." But it was no hallucination. They barricaded themselves in cargo hold number 1. 37 men, shivering from cold and fear, by the light of a few flashlights. Outside, the storm howled. The Malaspina groaned and settled deeper. The water was rising. The cold penetrated the steel, making the metal contract and crack. And then the last flashlight went out. Someone screamed. Someone began to pray. In the absolute impenetrable darkness, their hearing sharpened to unimaginable limits. They heard movement on the ceiling above them, on the deck, which was now almost a vertical wall. Not footsteps. Rather, a quiet, wet shuffling as if something heavy and wet was dragging its body across the iced metal. "Rats," the boatswain tried to convince himself. "Just ship's rats escaping." The shuffling stopped right above the hold hatch. A quiet, rhythmic scraping was heard. Something was scratching the steel from the outside. Methodically, relentlessly. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream came from the other end of the hold, a scream so full of primal dread that everyone's heart stopped. It was the stoker, Henry, screaming. "What is it?" "Henry," Vargas shouted, pointing his extinguished flashlight in that direction out of habit. But the darkness was absolute. Henry's screams turned into gurgling, choking sounds. A splash of water was heard, and a chomping, loud, wet, insatiable chomping, and a smell. A sweetish, rotten, unbearable stench of decay and the deep sea bursting into the hold, overwhelming the reek of fear and sweat. "Light! Give us light!" someone wailed. Someone frantically tried to light a lighter. The small flame tore a horrific picture from the darkness. Henry was lying on his back, in the icy water covering the floor. On his chest, hunched right over, his face, sat something. Humanoid but impossibly thin, with skin of a bluish-white, deathly waxen color. Long, bony limbs with webbing between the fingers gripped his head. The creature was doing something to his face. Teeth, claws. The lighter went out, leaving behind only a retina scorched by that nightmarish image and that terrible, wet sound. Pandemonium broke out in the hold. People rushed about in blind panic, bumping into each other, into piles of crates, falling into the icy water. Screams, prayers, cries of madness mingled into one dreadful chorus, and the scraping outside the hatch continued. And it was joined by new sounds, the same scraping, scratching from all sides. They were surrounded. They were inside the ship and outside. Vargas, pressing his back against the cold wall, understood. These weren't rocks. It was a trap. These creatures. They had caused the Exxon Valdez disaster as bait. They knew rescuers would come. They were waiting for fresh meat, locked in a steel trap, protected from the storm. Hunters, ancient, intelligent, merciless. "They're outside," someone shouted. "They're on the deck, dozens of them." The hold hatch was torn from its hinges with a crash. Against the backdrop of a slightly less black sky, a blizzard howled, and in the opening, one by one, silhouettes appeared. Tall, hunched, with long arms dragging along the deck. They descended into the hold unhurriedly, sliding rather than stepping. Their eyes, large and completely black, like those of deep-sea fish, reflected no light. They only absorbed it and the cold. They brought with them a freezing cold that made the air in the lungs freeze. The slaughter began. But not a massacre. There was no rage or malice. It was a cold, soulless harvest. The creatures grabbed people with their bony paws. Their touch caused instant frostbite. Flesh blackened and crumbled. They didn't kill immediately. They dragged their victims into the darkness, into the flooded compartments, from where only a last, bubbling gurgle and that same terrible, leisurely chomping could be heard. Vargas and a handful of sailors retreated, fighting back with wrenches, knives, bare hands. It was useless. The creatures didn't even pay attention. Their skin was hard, like frozen armor. The captain retreated to a far corner, into a small storeroom. He slammed the door and leaned against it, feeling several pairs of those same claws scraping at the metal from the outside. He was alone. In his jacket pocket was a chemical hand warmer, the last tiny source of heat in this kingdom of ice. The scraping suddenly stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the horrific sounds of feasting in the main hold. Then a quiet, hissing voice sounded, right at the crack of the door, a voice that sounded like cracking ice. "Vargas." Something hissed. It knew his name. "Warmth. Give the warmth." The door in front of him began to frost over. A thick, dense layer of ice crept over the metal, sealing the mechanism. The captain watched in horror as the door handle slowly turned into a block of ice. He understood. They weren't just being eaten. Their warmth, their life, their very energy, that's what they needed, what they absorbed like sponges. With mad determination, he pulled out the chemical warmer, broke it, activating the chemical reaction. The tiny heat source hissed in his palm. It was scalding hot. Outside, a furious scraping instantly erupted. The creatures were enraged by this flare of heat so close. They beat furiously against the door. Vargas pressed the warmer to his chest, feeling its heat seep through his clothing. It was a final act of defiance. He would not let them take him cold. He would die warm. The door was broken down with a crash. On the threshold, filling the doorway, stood it. Tall, thin, with bottomless black eyes in which all the frost of this cursed strait swirled. It stepped toward him, extending a long, bony paw with webbed fingers. Captain Elijah Vargas closed his eyes and exhaled a last stream of warm vapor. The rescue ship reached the site of the Malaspina's wreck 12 hours later, when the storm had subsided a little. The tanker lay on its side, half submerged, covered in a crust of ice like a huge dead fish. The rescue team in a boat made their way to its hull with great difficulty. The entire deck, all the superstructures, were encased in a thick layer of smooth, unnaturally even ice. Not a single crack, not a chip. It seemed the ship was frozen in a perfect sarcophagus. They found an entry hatch and began cutting a passage through the ice with torches. When they descended into the ship, horror gripped them. It was colder inside than outside. The walls, ceilings, floor, everything was covered in fluffy frost, like frost patterns. And there was an absolute, tomb-like silence. They found not a single body, no signs of a struggle, not a drop of blood. In the last hold, they found the only thing that broke the perfect icy symmetry. On the wall, someone had scratched words into the ice with a frozen knife or claw. Words that made seasoned sailors' blood run cold. They were here. They know our names. They are waiting for the next ones. And in the corner, sitting, leaning against the bulkhead, they found Captain Vargas. His body was completely frozen, covered in a thick layer of transparent glass-like ice. His face, visible through this shell, was contorted in a silent scream of inhuman horror. But the most terrifying thing was that he was clutching his hands tightly to his chest, and in them he held a small, completely empty, and also utterly frozen chemical hand warmer. And then one of the rescuers, the youngest, raised his flashlight higher and cried out. On the ceiling of the hold, also scratched, were maps, precise detailed maps of the entire Prince William Sound, and on them dozens, hundreds of new, unknown to science underwater rocks were marked, and arrows that pointed directly to the main shipping lanes. They weren't just waiting for the next ones, they were preparing new traps for them. My name is Mike Seddon. I will tell you a story about how our camping trip in the mountains ended horribly. It wasn't a roar, not the sound of breaking branches, but silence. Deep, all-consuming, unnatural silence that descended on the taiga like a shroud. That's what woke us up. Not screams, not sounds, but their complete absence. No squeaking of bats, no hooting of owls, not even the familiar rustle of leaves, as if someone had turned off the sound for the entire world. We were in Denali National Park, far from the beaten paths, in a place that was marked on the map as a scenic valley, but turned out to be a graveyard of ancient firs and silent black rocks. There were 3 of us, me, Mike, my younger brother Leo, a perpetual enthusiast with an insatiable thirst for adventure, and Sarah, his girlfriend, a biologist who was supposed to ensure our safety with her knowledge of nature. She was the one who insisted on this spot. This is the real, wild Alaska, not a Disneyland for tourists. The first evening was wonderful. We set up 2 tents, ours with Leo and Sarah's about 10 meters away, at the foot of a giant spruce tree. We lit a fire. Stu laughed. Sarah gave us a lecture on precautions, all provisions in special containers, hung on a steel cable between trees far from the camp. Not a crumb on the ground, bear spray in every tent, within reach. The main thing is not to panic. Black bears are timid, and grizzlies, if not provoked, usually avoid people, she said, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. How wrong she was. She was talking about animals. But what came to us at night was not an animal. I woke up because I froze. Not from a sound, but from a feeling. A sharp, nauseatingly familiar feeling, as if you're alone in an apartment and realize the door has just closed quietly. Leo was sleeping next to me, his steady breathing the only sound. And then I heard it. Not a rustle, not a footstep. It was a scrape. One slow, drawn-out scrape on the canvas of the tent from the outside right by my head, as if someone had dragged a long, hard fingernail across it. I froze, my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. Leo stirred. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely squeezing the air out of my lungs. He didn't answer. The scrape repeated. And again. And again. Now. It was no accident. It was a methodical, unhurried sound. Someone or something was slowly, deliberately dragging something sharp across our tent, in a circle. "Leo." I poked him in the side, my voice breaking into a shrill whisper. He sat up, instantly awake. In the dark, I could only see the white, wide-eyed whites of his eyes. Scrape, scrape, scurry, rape. And then another sound joined it, breathing, low, hoarse, wet, not like a sleeping dog's. It was too slow, too deliberate. Inhale, a 5-second pause. Exhale, long, wheezing, as if from punctured lungs. And this sound was right outside, a centimeter from my ear. I panicked, grabbed the flashlight, found the button with trembling fingers. The beam of light, blinding in the pitch darkness, hit the tent wall, and we saw it. On the canvas, as on a shadow theater screen, appeared a huge, monstrously proportioned shadow. It was a head, but not a bear's. A bear's snout is shorter, its forehead more sloping. This one had a high, sloping forehead and an elongated muzzle, almost wolf-like, but more massive, more powerful. And the ears, God, the ears were too long and pointed like a bat's. The shadow turned slowly, sniffing the air. We heard its wet nose noisily inhaling the air, inhaling our scent. "Bear," Leo whispered, gasping, and reached for the pepper spray canister. The shadow froze, as if it had heard. The head turned toward us, and we saw the outline of its maw in profile. It was slightly open, and a long, black, unnaturally long tongue hung from it. It slowly dragged across the tent fabric, leaving a wet, dark trail. It was not a bear. It began to walk. Slowly, incredibly heavily. Its shadow moved in a circle around our tent. We sat back to back, clutching the canisters in our sweaty palms, ready for an attack that seemed as pointless as spitting into a hurricane. "It will leave," Leo muttered hysterically. "It will sniff and leave," Sarah said. Suddenly, the shadow vanished. The breathing stopped. It became quiet. Too quiet. Did it leave? I dared to exhale. At that moment, from outside, right above our heads, came a sound that made the blood freeze in our veins. It wasn't a roar. It was laughter. Low, guttural, full of absolute inhuman mockery. It lasted a few seconds, then was replaced by a dull blow to the tent, so powerful that the poles bent and we almost collapsed on top of each other. Then, footsteps. heavy, receding. We sat, not breathing, listening. The footsteps faded into the distance. God, what was that? Leo was crying, his body shaking with coarse tremors. I didn't answer. I was listening, and through the beating of my own heart, I heard a new sound, muffled, coming from the direction of Sarah's tent. A glassy, vibrating sound. Ding, ding, ding. As if someone was dragging a claw across the strings of the guitar that hung on the flip bracket of her tent. Sarah, I whispered. Silently, having agreed with our eyes, we dared the unthinkable. We had to check. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The night was moonlit. Silvery light flooded the clearing. Our food bags hung in their place, untouched. Nothing was visible. And then my gaze fell on Sarah's tent. The door was unzipped. The flap was thrown back, and moonlight poured from inside. And on the white canvas of her tent, as on a canvas, a single word was scrawled by a giant paw, scratched so deeply that the fabric hung in tatters. A word that made our hair stand on end. Thank you. We rushed over, screaming her name. The tent was empty. The sleeping bag was wide open, cold inside. Her backpack had been neatly gutted, all items sorted into piles. The can of bear spray lay on the pillow, untouched. There was not a drop of blood, no signs of a struggle. Only a terrifying, inexplicable neatness. And that word, that ghastly mocking thank you. And on the floor, next to her sleeping bag, lay that very fingernail. A long, curved, black and sharp shard of a claw like a dagger. It was sticky to the touch and smelled of bear, swamp muck, and something else. Sweetish, chemical, like formalin. We panicked, grabbed the essentials, and ran. We ran all night, stumbling over roots, lashing our faces with branches, not choosing a path. We ran from that place, from that word, from that laughter. We were lucky. In the morning, we reached a tourist trail and were picked up by a group of rangers. We were breathless, trying to tell them. They looked at us with pity and skepticism. Two frightened city boys spinning wild tales about a forest monster. They searched our tent, found that claw. Looks like a Kodiak bear claw, said the senior ranger, turning it over in his hands. A huge specimen. You're incredibly lucky it just scratched your tent and left. As for your friend, he sighed heavily. Bears sometimes drag people away. Quickly and quietly. There couldn't be any thank you. You're in shock, you imagined it. You could not believe him. He was an authority. He knew these woods, but he didn't see that shadow. He didn't hear that laughter. Sarah was never found. The search yielded nothing. The official version is a bear attack. 3 months have passed. I'm trying to get back to life. Leo has turned to drink. He can't sleep without a light on. He says he hears scraping on the glass of his third-floor apartment at night. And yesterday I received a package. No return address. In a cardboard box lay Sarah's guitar, the very instrument whose strings were stroked by a claw that night. A note was tied to the neck. The paper was rough, stained with dirt and something dark, sticky. The text was written not in ink, but in something brown, and the letters were carefully, almost calligraphically formed. Thank you for the meal. She was sweet. We await the next. Spring will be long and hunger. My name is Leslie Snowy. This happened to my college friends. I'll tell you now. We thought it would be the most romantic adventure of our lives. To ditch everything, buy ferry tickets to Alaska, hire a small plane to Skagway, and from there, just our feet, a tent, and the vast, piercingly beautiful wilderness. We wanted to escape the office noise, the constant hum of cars, and the intrusive glow of screens. We were searching for silence. We found something entirely different. The car we rented in Skagway rattled over every bump of the old logging road, taking us further and further from any signs of civilization. The maps showed only approximate outlines, but we were confident. Ethan was driving, and I was in the passenger seat with a tablet open on my lap, trying to match the satellite images with the reality outside the window. "I think we turn here." I pointed to a barely noticeable track leading into a thicket of spruce trees. Ethan snorted skeptically but turned. Branches whipped against the windows as if trying to drive us away. After half an hour of jolting, we drove out into a small clearing, bounded on one side by a rocky slope and on the other by a dark wall of forest. And in the middle of the clearing, nestled against the rock, stood it. The cabin. It was exactly what an abandoned prospector's cabin from the gold rush era should be. Low, slanted, built from logs blackened by time. The roof, made of rough slabs, had collapsed in several places. The window was boarded up with a rotten plank. The air smelled of damp rot, pine needles and something else, a sweetish, ancient scent of desolation. "Wow." Ethan exhaled, killing the engine. "Real history, just like in those blogs you read." I nodded, but for some reason, no delight came. Instead, a light, cold shiver ran down my spine. The place was lifeless. Not just quiet, but dead. Not a single bird sang. No insects chirped. Only the wind rustled the tops of the giant spruces, and that sound was like a heavy, weary sigh. "It's too creepy, Ethan. Maybe let's go further, find somewhere brighter." "What are you talking about? It's perfect." He was already jumping out of the car, breathing in the cold air with his whole chest. "Real atmosphere. We'll set up camp right here. Look at the wind protection from the cliff." Arguing was useless. His enthusiasm was always contagious. But now I only felt a growing anxiety, irrational and sticky like a spider's web. While Ethan unloaded the tent and sleeping bags, I approached the cabin. The door hung on one hinge, slightly ajar into a black slit of interior space. I pushed it, and it gave way with a creak. Inside, it was dark and cramped, a feeling of time having stopped 100 years ago. In the corner, a pile of rot that had once been a cot, a small iron stove, rusted through. On a crude table made of an unhewn log stood a tin cup. I mechanically reached for it, but immediately pulled my hand back. Touching it felt like a sacrilege. It was the only object that didn't look completely destroyed by time. It even had traces of paint on it. A faded red stripe. It seemed alien, not belonging to this gloomy place, as if someone had left it there very recently. "Leah, come help," Ethan called. I hurried out into the light, trying to shake off the dark thoughts. We quickly set up the tent about 20 meters from the cabin, facing the forest, with our backs to the cliff. The sky in the west was rapidly burying the sun behind heavy, leaden clouds. "It's going to rain," Ethan stated, finishing with the guy lines. He wasn't wrong. The first heavy drops began to drum on the tent fabric almost as soon as we got inside and zipped up the entrance. Soon, the drumming turned into a solid, booming downpour. The wind grew stronger, swaying the treetops and stretching the tent, fly like a sail. We sat, huddled together by the light of a gas lantern, drinking tea and listening to the symphony of the elements. It seemed the whole world had shrunk to this small, bright dome, outside the walls of which a storm was raging. It was because of this all-encompassing noise that we didn't make out the other sound at first. I froze with the mug in my hands. Did you hear that? The rain? Yeah, that's all it is. Ethan smiled. No, not the rain. We fell silent, listening, and through the noise of the water, through the howling of the wind, something else reached us. Clear, undeniable. Shuffling. Slow, heavy steps on wet gravel. Someone was walking around our tent. My heart sank. My fingers turned cold. Ethan? I whispered. He put a finger to his lips. His face became serious, alert. He slowly reached for the large flashlight lying by the entrance. A bear? I breathed out. In this weather? Doubtful, he replied just as quietly. The steps were too regular for an animal. It was a rhythmic, measured human stride. Definitely. Step pause. Step pause. Someone was slowly walking in a circle, right next to the walls of the tent. We held our breath. I could feel my heart pounding wildly and was sure the thumping was audible from outside. And then, a voice broke through the noise of the rain. Quiet, cracked, monotonous. It wasn't singing so much as mumbling, in a chant, the same infinitely sad melody. The words were impossible to make out, only an endless, mournful tune, so full of sorrow and hopelessness that tears began to stream down my cheeks of their own accord. It was the sound of absolute, all-consuming loneliness. Ethan, pale as a sheet, gripped the flashlight so hard his knuckles turned white. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, and his voice, usually so confident, trembled. The steps stopped. The singing ceased. A silence fell, now seeming even more sinister than that eerie chant. All that could be heard was the rain beating against the fabric. We didn't breathe, expecting anything. A blow to the tent, a growl, a scream. But nothing happened. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tension began to ease slightly. "He's gone," Ethan whispered, exhaling. "Some drifter, probably. Missing his cue for a ghost tour." He tried to joke, but the joke fell flat and unconvincing. We didn't sleep until morning, sitting embraced and listening to every rustle. But nothing else disturbed the night's peace except for the bad weather. Dawn came grey and damp. The rain had turned into a drizzling mist. I felt shattered, my nerves stretched taut like strings. Ethan, trying to look cheerful, was the first to climb out of the tent. No one, see, no tracks, no... He fell silent mid-sentence. I climbed out after him and saw what he was staring at. Right in front of the tent entrance, on the wet gravel, lay an object. A rusty tin gold panning cup. The same one I had seen yesterday on the table in the cabin, but now it was here. At its bottom, mixed with rainwater, lay a small handful of wet yellow sand and a few small but absolutely real gold nuggets. And next to the cup, in the sodden earth, was an imprint. A clear, distinct mark from a rough boot. A single one. As if someone had approached, placed the cup, and frozen, staring at our tent. Vanished. We silently packed up the camp, our movements sharp, automatic. I didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at me. We were too scared to admit to each other what we had seen and heard. Our minds desperately clung to logical explanations, a hoax, a local madman. But on an animal, primal level, we knew. We knew it was something else. We had almost everything loaded into the car when an SUV from the National Park Service came around the bend onto the clearing. A ranger was driving, a man in his 50s with a tired, weathered face. He looked surprised to see us. "Early. Birds," he said, getting out of the car. "Or just lost. This road doesn't go anywhere. We camped here for the night," Ethan answered, and his voice still sounded strained. The ranger glanced at our tent, now almost packed up, then looked at the cabin, and his expression changed. Weariness was replaced by wariness and slight pity. "I see," he drawled. "So, not a peaceful night?" We exchanged glances. His question didn't sound like a formality. "Why do you ask?" I asked quietly. The ranger sighed, pulled a thermos from a leather case on his belt, poured himself some coffee, and gestured to offer us some. We silently declined. "This place, it has a bad reputation. Locals try not to come here. Haven't seen tourists here for about 5 years." "A ghost?" Ethan blurted out, and his voice held a hope that it was still someone's stupid joke. The ranger was silent for a moment, looking at the cabin. "You could call it that. Legend says a guy lived here, Jack McClure, one of the thousands who came here during the gold rush, hungry for wealth. Found a vein, a good one. But it was a prime spot. Everyone wanted a piece. One day he came back from working his claim to find it. His claim had been jumped by a gang of lowlifes. He tried to fight. They didn't go easy on him. Took everything he'd gathered and threw his body down a mine shaft back there. Behind the cliff, he pointed his hand deep into the forest. They say he never came to terms with it, never found his gold, can't move on, he's still looking for it, and sometimes he comes out to people, asks, sometimes just watches, and leaves. Souvenirs." I looked at the cup I was clutching in my hand. It suddenly felt icy. "What does he ask?" I whispered. The ranger looked at me, and there was no mockery or doubt in his eyes. Only heavy, weary truth. He asks, "Have you seen my gold?" And sometimes he offers a deal, leaves a little gold as a down payment. And then he comes back for the payment, for the settlement. We silently got into the car and drove away. I watched in the side mirror until the cabin disappeared from view, clutching that same cup in my hands. We didn't tell the ranger about it. I don't know why. Maybe because of the greedy glint in Ethan's eyes when he saw the nuggets. Maybe because of some dark, whispering curiosity inside me. A week passed. We returned home to our cozy, safe world. But something broke. That night's horror wouldn't let go. We stopped talking about the incident, but it hung between us like a heavy, unspoken secret. Ethan became withdrawn. He could sit for hours on end, staring at those few grains of gold we had brought back, sifting them from hand to hand. And then it started. First, there were sounds at night. Not in the forest, but here in the city. I would wake up hearing, through the sound of rain outside the window, and it had been raining non-stop all these days for some reason. Quiet, shuffling steps under our balcony, and that same cracked, monotonous chant. It was quieter than it had been in the forest, but that only made it clearer. Then I started finding sand. Yellow, coarse prospector's sand. On the mat by the front door, on the windowsill, in the pocket of my robe. Ethan didn't hear or see anything. He retreated deeper into himself. His obsession with that gold grew. He scoured the internet, looked at old maps, calculated where Jack McClure's claim might have been. He barely slept anymore. His eyes burned with a feverish gleam, very similar to the one that must have been in the eyes of the prospectors of the past. "He's just showing me the way, Leah," he said to me one morning. "He wants me to find it. Our gold, our fortune." There was a strange, eerie certainty in his voice. That night, I woke up because the apartment was cold. Frosty air, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, filled the bedroom. Ethan was sleeping restlessly, tossing and turning and mumbling something in his sleep, and I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the room, illuminated by moonlight. A tall, thin, almost transparent silhouette in tattered, soaking wet clothes. His face wasn't visible, just a shadow under the brim of a sodden hat. But I could feel his gaze. A gaze of endless, insatiable craving. He slowly raised his hand. In his pale, almost skeletal fingers was that same rusty cup. He held it out in our direction, toward the bed. The gesture was both an offering and a terrible accusation. I squeezed my eyes shut, burying my face in the pillow, trying to scream but making no sound. When I dared to look again, there was no one in the corner. But on the floor, on the parquet, was a wet trail of gravel and yellow sand, leading from the corner straight to our bed. And in the sand were the clear imprints of rough boots. My name is Russell. I'm 24 years old. I love solitude, travel, and previously unknown routes, and this story happened to me last year. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is a different kind of sound. It has density, taste, weight. It presses on the eardrums, makes the blood pound in your temples louder than any drum, and your own breathing seems like the deafening roar of a jet engine. I know this. I was searching for it, and I found something that silence was hiding in its womb. My name is Russell, and I am a professional at running away from the world. My life is a network of routes through the most remote corners of the planet, where the only Wi-Fi is the crack of twigs underfoot, and the only notifications come from changes in the weather. I was searching for the absolute, the final frontier, beyond which there is only you and the universe, stripped of human noise. Such a place was supposed to be the valley of the Chulitna River in Alaska. Deaf, inaccessible, cut off from civilization by a ring of impregnable mountains. The maps showed only approximate outlines. Satellite images showed a green sea of taiga, split by a turquoise thread of a river. Perfect. The helicopter, an old Bell piloted by a grim Aleut named Jack, dropped me on a gravel spit, a 2-day walk, from the presumed center of the valley. Are you sure this is the right place? His voice, after half an hour of rotor thunder, seemed unnaturally loud. The place is strange. That's the point. I grinned, unloading the last backpack. No, you don't understand. It's too quiet here. He paused, looking at the dark wall of forest pressing right up to the water. Not naturally quiet, but empty. Birds don't sing. Animals avoid it. The locals don't hunt here. Legends? I asked with a touch of professional condescension. Don't know, just quiet, as if someone sucked out all the sounds. Listen, I can come back in 4 days, not 7. No need. Exactly in 7. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and without saying goodbye, climbed into the cockpit. The helicopter roared, kicked up a whirlwind of gravel and dust, lifted off the ground, and disappeared behind a jagged ridge of mountains. And then it happened. A wave of sound surged and receded. The echo of the rotors dissolved into the air, and in its place came something. Not just an absence of noise, a physical sensation of vacuum. The air became thick, like jelly. The pressure in my ears increased, as if I'd dived to a depth of 100 meters. I froze, and in this sudden muteness, my own heartbeat sounded like a dull drumbeat somewhere inside my skull. Inhale. Exhale. the rush of blood in my vessels. That was all. Nothing more. No rustle of leaves, no buzzing of insects, no whine of mosquitoes. No bird's cry. Even the river, wide and surely powerful, flowed in complete silence. Its water rolled over boulders but didn't make a single sound. It was eerie, unpleasant, unnatural. I felt a slight panic, a cold tickle in the pit of my stomach. I took a deep breath and forced myself to smile. This is exactly what you wanted, Russell. Absolute silence. Welcome. The first day was the hardest. My brain, unaccustomed to such sensory starvation, rebelled. It pulled fragments of melodies, announcers' voices, the sound of a keyboard from my memory. I caught myself monotonously whistling. Nothing, just to fill the void. But the whistle died, producing no echo, swallowed by the all-consuming stillness. I set up camp on a high bank, away from the soundless river. The habitual actions, pitching the tent, lighting a fire, the fire also burned silently without crackling, were calming. Night fell, black, moonless. The stars hung motionless and just as soundless in the sky. I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell into a sleep that was just as deaf and silent. The second day began with the same oppressive silence, but now I was starting to get used to it. The panic receded, replaced by a strange euphoria. I was the only sounding object in the entire universe, the god of my own microcosm. I spoke aloud to myself, and my voice fell to the ground like a heavy stone, not bouncing, not reflecting. I enjoyed this anomaly, writing in my journal. Day 2. Acoustic vacuum stable, sensations fantastic. Audibility of my own body is 100%. I think I can hear my hair growing. By the evening of the second day, everything changed. Was sitting by the fire, or rather by the silent hearth with a flame, eating stew and listening to the beating of my heart. And suddenly, at the very bottom of that beat, I caught something else. Barely noticeable scratching. I froze, held my breath. The silence remained the same, deaf and absolute. But inside it, at the very edge of perception, there was something. As if someone had run a wet finger over glass. I strained my hearing, turned my head. The sound didn't get louder or change location. It was everywhere and nowhere. It came from the darkening forest, from the river, from the stones under my feet, from the air itself. It was a whisper, an indistinct white noise consisting of millions of microscopic sounds merged into a single monotonous hum. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The leaves on the trees didn't stir. I wrote it off as fatigue, a trick of the mind, desperately trying to find some external stimulus. Auditory hallucinations, I wrote confidently in my journal. A classic effect of sensory deprivation. The brain starts generating noise on its own. But at night, the whisper grew louder. It didn't break the silence. It was part of it. It was the silence itself that had suddenly found a voice. I lay in the tent, and this whisper surrounded me, enveloped me like a cocoon. It flowed along the tent walls, seeped through the ground. It wasn't chaotic white noise. It had structure, rhythm. It was like a distant conversation in an unknown language, like the murmur of a stream, like the rustle of pages in an old book. Sometimes I thought I was about to make out individual words, as if someone was calling my name, as if someone was arguing, as if someone was crying. I didn't sleep. I pressed my head into the pillow, plugged my ears with my fingers, but it didn't help. The whisper wasn't born outside. It originated inside my skull. But it was alien. It was a product of my brain, but I couldn't control it. It was the most terrifying sensation of my life, to be alone in absolute silence and yet feel that you are not alone, because your own mind has started speaking to you in a language you don't understand. By the morning of the third day, I was on the edge. The whisper didn't cease for a second. It became the background of my existence. I walked around the camp, and it walked with me, whispering something in my ear. I tried to shout to drown it out, but my own cry drowned in this whisper like a stone in a swamp. It was stronger, and then I began to understand. It happened suddenly. I was sitting on the bank, looking at the soundless water, and the whisper, as usual, poured out in a continuous stream. And suddenly, it folded into a clear, distinct phrase. Quiet, spoken in the same impersonal, monotonous whisper, but absolutely understandable. Should not have come here. I shuddered and turned around. No one. Just the forest, the stones, and the oppressive silence now filled with meaning. "Who's there?" I croaked. My voice sounded pathetic and stupid. In response, the whisper fell silent for a moment, then resumed with new force, now with a hint of irritation, impatience. "He hears us. Deep, alone. We'll stay." Phrases washed over each other, intertwined, were born from nothing and went nowhere. It was a choir, millions of voices speaking at once, and yet it was one voice, the voice of the valley itself. This was not psychosis. I could have dealt with psychosis. This was something else. My brain, deprived of external data, was desperately trying to process something. And it found something. It tuned into the frequency on which this very silence was broadcasting. It became an antenna, picking up the whisper of the stones, the trees, the water, and the earth. A whisper that had always been there, but which was never heard because of the noise of civilization, because of the wind, because of life. It was the voice of loneliness itself, the voice of emptiness, the voice of eternity, which was here before me and will be after. And this voice was angry. No, not angry, indifferent, cold. As indifferent as stones in a scree are to each other, and in this indifference lay the true horror. Bone is broken. Cold. Mom. No one will find. Like that other one, with the red beard. They knew me. They saw me. They remembered everyone who had come here, and everyone who had stayed. I ran. I abandoned the camp, grabbed a backpack with the essentials, and ran downstream to where the helicopter was supposed to wait in 4 days. The whisper ran with me. It came from under my feet, from the air I was breathing. Where? Still. Here. Ours. I ran all day, stumbling over silent stones, pushing through the soundless forest. I fell, got up and ran on, clamping my ears with my palms, trying to tear this alien voice out of my head. But it was inside. It had become a part of me. By evening I was exhausted and collapsed at the foot of an old spruce. I cried. I begged them to stop. The whisper in response became quieter, more affectionate, but that only made it scarier. Sleep. Rest. We are with you forever. I slipped into oblivion, into a nightmare where I was a stone, silent and unfeeling. And people came to me, fell down nearby, and began to whisper, and their whisper lasted an eternity. I don't know how much time passed, hours a day. I lay and looked into the soundless sky, and the whisper had almost merged with my thoughts. I almost stopped understanding where I was and where they were. And suddenly, first, it was a barely noticeable change in pressure. Then, a distant growing rumble. It cut the silence like a knife. The whisper became agitated, hissed, tried to get louder to drown it out. But the rumble grew. It was a sound, a real, physical, crude sound of an engine, a helicopter. And as it approached, the whisper began to weaken. It melted like smoke in the wind, broke into incoherent fragments, lost its strength and meaning. I raised my head and saw a metal dragonfly in a break in the clouds. It was flying in the distance, not even towards me, just crossing the edge of the valley, but it was enough. The sound of its rotors, crude, mechanical, alien to this place, tore apart the acoustic vacuum. It was like a switch being flipped. The whisper cut off, immediately, sharply, as if it had never been. There was just silence. Ordinary, natural, albeit still oppressive, but familiar. I heard the wind stirring the branches of the spruce above my head. I heard my own moan. I lay and cried, sobbing with happiness and horror, listening to the gasoline heart of the helicopter, which was my salvation. Jack found me the next day. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just silently helped me into the cockpit. When we took off and the Chulitna Valley floated beneath us like a green, silent grave, he leaned toward me. "Well, found your silence?" I looked at him. I wanted to tell him everything. About the whisper, about the voices, about how the silence spoke to me, but I just nodded and turned to the window. I returned to the city, returned to the noise of cars, people's voices, the blare of music from neighbors' windows. I never turn off the light at night. I always leave the TV or radio on the quietest whisper setting, just to have background noise, just to fill the space. Because I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if it gets too quiet, I'll start listening again. And I will hear, and I will understand that it's not a hallucination, that the voices haven't gone anywhere. They are always there, in the very depths of the silence. They are, waiting for all the sounds to die down again, for the world to fall silent. And then they will speak to me again, and this time I might understand them. My name is Leo Jr. Scandani. I love my friends very much, and we often vacation together. We went to Alaska for freedom, for a breath of air so pure you could almost drink it, for a silence that rings in your ears louder than any metropolis. We found both the air and the silence, and something else, something ancient and hungry. There were 5 of us, me, Leo, his girlfriend Anya, our mutual friend Mike, and his younger sister, the ever-present 19-year-old Yulia, who had begged to come with us to make content for her travel blog. Our destination was a lake at the foot of the Mendenhall Glacier, reachable only by off-road vehicle and then on foot along a barely visible trail. A place untouched by civilization, the perfect spot. The first signs began a kilometer before the lake. A faint, barely audible hum, like a distant generator. The air, once crystal clear, acquired a strange vibration, as if trembling with tension. "Do you hear that?" Yulia asked, frowning and stopping. She turned her camera towards the forest, a sort of hum. "Bees or noise from the glacier," Mike dismissed, the older brother who always knew best. "Keep moving, or we won't get there before nightfall." But here, in the height of summer, there was no night. There was a white night, that ghostly twilight state where the sun only briefly touches the horizon, painting everything in lilac and golden tones. We walked in this surreal light, and the hum grew louder. And then we reached the lake. The sight was surreal and simultaneously terrifying. The water was a perfect mirror, reflecting the snowy peaks and the turquoise ice of the glacier. The air above the water trembled. A dark, almost black cloud seethed, pulsated, right over the shore. This was the swarm, a mosquito swarm. But we had never seen mosquitoes like these. They were larger than usual, with long, almost elegant legs, and their bodies had a metallic, steely sheen. Mother of God. Leo exhaled. Well, we came prepared. Nets, DEET repellent, we did everything. The repellent, which we generously doused ourselves with right then, had no effect. None whatsoever. The mosquitoes weren't just unafraid of it, they seemed to enjoy it, like a condiment. They took their first victim immediately. Yulia, who had approached the water's edge to film a panorama, cried out. We turned. Her arm, raised with her phone, had turned black from the insects covering it. They weren't just biting, they were enveloping it in a dense, writhing sleeve. With wild shouts, we rushed to her, waving our arms. It was like hitting thick smoke. Our hands plunged into the swarm. Brushing off dozens, but hundreds more immediately took their place. Their bites were painful, like jabs from red-hot needles. We somehow dragged Yulia back to the campsite we were hastily setting up further from the water. Pitching the tents became a hellish ordeal. Mosquitoes flew into our eyes, noses, and mouths. They crawled under our clothes, burrowed into the skin of our eyelids and earlobes. We worked in silence, teeth clenched, our faces twisted in grimaces of disgust and pain. Their hum drowned out everything. It was inside our skulls. It vibrated in our bones. When we crawled into the first pitched tent, it wasn't much better. We zipped up the mosquito net, and within a second it turned black. A layer of insects so dense had stuck to the outside that they blocked out the dim light of the white night. It became dark as a cellar inside the tent. We sat in the semi-darkness, illuminated only by the screen of Yulia's phone, and listened. The quiet, furious rustle of millions of wings scraping against the net. A constant, nerve-wracking sound, promising that this barrier was unreliable. I can't do this, Anya cried, wrapped head to toe in her sleeping bag, but even there, inside, her muffled sighs and the annoying whine of one or two mosquitoes that had managed to get in could be heard. Hunger took its toll about 2 hours later. We had to eat. Mike, the toughest of us, volunteered to cook. We watched his exit outside, pressed against the net like prisoners. He unzipped the tent, slipped out, and immediately zipped it shut behind him. Outside, a frantic dance began. He darted around, waving his arms, trying to open the backpack with provisions. His figure would disappear from view, completely hidden by the black swarm, then reappear. He returned after 5 minutes. His face looked like bubble wrap, a mass of red welts. In his hands, he clutched a pack of crackers and a chocolate bar. Can't, he rasped, falling to his knees and shaking off dozens of insects that had flown in with him. Out there. It's impossible out there. They get into the food. They're eating it. He showed us the chocolate bar. A few mosquitoes writhed on the bar, their crushed bodies mingling with the brown mass. Dinner was cancelled. We tried to drink water, straining it through our teeth, spitting out tiny, crunchy bodies. Yulia threw up. The night that wasn't stretched on infinitely. Sleep was impossible. The whisper of wings beyond the wall, the constant fear that the net would tear, that they would find a gap. And the bites. They didn't just itch. They burned. The wounds were inflamed and throbbing. Yulia developed a fever. She was delirious, shaking with chills, even though it was stuffy in the tent. In the morning, if it could be called morning, the situation hadn't improved. There was no more light. The layer of mosquitoes on the tent had only grown denser. We lived in a sticky, stuffy darkness, the air thick with our fear and sweat. "We're leaving. Right now," Leo announced, his voice trembling. Everyone nodded, silently. Packing up was like a frantic escape from a besieged fortress. We jumped out one by one, holding our breath, yanking up stakes, dumping the tents into wet, sticky piles without even trying to fold them. The mosquitoes blinded us, crawled into our ears, their hum paralyzing our minds. We breathed them in. We abandoned half our gear. We didn't have the strength to carry it. Mike carried Yulia on his back. She was moaning weakly, her face unrecognizably swollen. We ran down the trail, stumbling, falling, scraping our knees bloody, which were immediately covered with a new layer of insects. And then Leo, who was running ahead, screamed. Not a cry of pain or fear, but a scream of pure animal panic. He stopped, pointing a finger forward. The trail ended. Before us was a wall of mosquitoes. They had gathered into an unimaginably dense mass, utterly black, impenetrable. They formed a barrier between the tree trunks, from the ground to the very tops. This wall hummed. It was the horn of an ocean liner, the roar of a jet engine. It vibrated, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to vibrate in unison. "This is impossible." Mike howled. "We came this way." We darted to the side into the thicket, hoping to go around. 20 meters later, an identical wall stopped us, and to the right. We were trapped, in the center of a giant living circle that slowly, inexorably began to contract. They weren't just flying. They were acting, in concert, like a single intelligent, predatory organism. Retreating, we came out onto the lakeshore again. With our backs to the icy water, we watched the advancing darkness. The hum was so loud we couldn't hear our own screams. Anya prayed. Leo hugged her, and then Yulia, who Mike had set on her feet, weakly stretched her hand forward. "Look," her voice was barely audible over the roar. They're not just biting." We looked closer. The mosquitoes in the front rows weren't rushing at us. They were landing on the ground, on the rocks, on the tree trunks, and laying eggs. Tiny, black, shiny eggs. They covered everything around us, and we understood. They didn't just want our blood. They were preparing this place for their offspring. They were cleansing it of us. The first step forward wasn't taken by the swarm, it was taken by Leo. His eyes were glazed over. A quiet, insane phrase escaped his lips. "Don't resist. Become a part of it. Become part of the whole." "Leo." "No," I screamed. But he was already walking towards the wall, arms spread wide as if to embrace it. The darkness consumed him instantly. We didn't see his body. We only saw a black, writhing cocoon his size that for a second held the shape of a man, then collapsed to the ground, and the hum grew only louder, more saturated. This broke Anya. With a scream, she rushed to the spot where Leo had disappeared, and she was consumed. Mike, growling like an animal, grabbed me and Yulia and dragged us into the water. The icy water of the lake burned our skin, but it was a shock that brought us back to life. The mosquitoes didn't fly over the water. They lined up on the shore, a solid, pulsating black line, watching. We swam. Where to? Away. Just away. I paddled. He dragged the weakened Yulia. We swam for maybe an hour, maybe 2. The glacier's tongue drew nearer. Hope flickered. Reach the ice. They wouldn't be there. We scrambled onto a rocky spit at the foot of the glacier. Behind us, on the opposite shore, our nightmare stood like a dark stripe. But here, on the ice, they truly weren't. The silence deafened us. All we could hear was our heavy breathing and the splash of water. Mike set Yulia down on the rocks. We collapsed next to her, unable to speak. The silence was first broken by Yulia's weak moan. She propped herself up on an elbow and looked at her leg. On her ankle, in a bite wound scratched raw to the flesh, something was moving, something white and tiny. She screamed and began to scratch at her skin with her nails, but it wasn't on the outside, it was inside. I looked at my own hands, at every inflamed, festering bite, and I felt it. A slight, barely perceptible movement under the skin. A tickling, living sensation. Mike met my gaze. His eyes were full of the same horror, the same understanding. They had laid them inside us, their larvae. They hadn't just drunk our blood, they had used us. As incubators, as a warm, nutrient-rich medium for their new swarm. We hadn't escaped. We had simply brought them with us. We are sitting on this rock now, in the shadow of the glacier. We don't speak. We listen. To the silence outside. And to the quiet, inexorable stirring inside. The waiting. The waiting for something new and hungry to awaken and break free. All we can do is wait. And listen as my own skin begins to quietly.
The first story, the monitor showed a flat line of my heart, but I could still hear someone breathing loudly behind the screen. The air froze in my lungs, turning into a lump of stabbing ice. I blinked, trying to clear the sticky film from my eyes. Everything was blurry. The ceiling with its matte shades, the faded blue curtains, the ghostly outlines of medical equipment. I was lying on my back. My body was heavy alien, saturated to the bone with the chemical cotton wool of anesthesia. But I could feel the cold starch of the sheet under my fingers, a dull aching pain deep in my abdomen, and that sound, a monotone, piercing, relentless beep. It came from somewhere above and to the right. I turned my head with effort, and the world tilted. A green screen, on it a smooth, lifeless straight line. I knew what it meant. I'd seen it in dozens of TV shows. A flat line means the end, silence, death. But I could hear that beep. I could feel the pain. I could see. My heart didn't start pounding in response to the panic. It just kept beating steadily, lazily, somewhere deep inside, completely out of sync with the soul-chilling proof on the monitor. I tried to raise my hand, to touch my face, my chest, but my fingers only twitched, bumping against hard restraints. And then my hearing, sharpened to an animal acuity, picked out another sound. Right here, in this dimly lit room, breathing, deep, wet, with a whistle on the inhale and a gurgling rasp on the exhale. It came from behind the thin white screen separating my bed from the next one. Someone was there, someone very close. "Nurse," I tried to say, but only a hoarse, indistinct sound escaped my throat. "Who's there?" In response, only that breathing. It seemed so loud it drowned out even the obsessive beep of the monitor. It filled the space, crawled into my ears, and lay on my chest like a heavy weight. The screen was made of a thin, light-filtering material. I could make out a vague shadow on the other side, tall, unfocused. It wasn't moving. It was just there, and breathing. Panic, sticky and sweet, rose in my throat. I tried to scream again, to move, but my body was a traitor, paralyzed and silent. A new shadow appeared in the doorway. A nurse walked in, an older woman with a tired, gaunt face. She walked slowly, muttering to herself, checking a tablet. Her gaze slid over my monitor, over that same flat green line. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't rush to save me. She just sighed, as if seeing something annoying but familiar, and made a note on the electronic chart. Her fingers poked lazily at the screen. The monitor's beep continued. I'm alive, I hissed, gathering all my willpower. The nurse looked up at me. There was no surprise or fear in her eyes, only a deep, burnt-out professional boredom. Of course you are, dear. The machine's just glitching. Third time this week. They'll fix it. Her voice was flat, devoid of intonation. She didn't even come closer to check my pulse, to lean in, to listen to my breathing. Her gaze returned to the tablet, and the breathing behind the screen grew closer. The shadow behind the white fabric shifted. Now it seemed taller, more massive. The rasping grew louder, clearer. I could have sworn I felt a slight movement of air, as if the screen's fabric had stirred from that breathing. There's someone, I squeezed out, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. The nurse frowned, looking up from her tablet for a second. She looked at the screen, then at me. There's no one else in the room, dear. Your roommate, Marfa Ignatievna, was discharged today. You mustn't get upset after surgery. Sleep. She turned and walked out, her footsteps fading down the hall. I was left alone. The flat green line of my death, the monotonous beep, and it behind the screen. I was alone with that breathing, which was now the only sound that held any meaning in this insane world. It was real, more real than the nurse's indifference, more real than the lying monitor. Time passed. A minute, an hour, I couldn't tell. I lay there staring at the screen, frozen, trying not to breathe so I could hear it better, to understand what it was doing. And it was only doing one thing, breathing, and getting closer. The shadow shifted again. Now, it was right at the seam where the two panels of the screen met. I could see a vague outline, tall with sloping, unnaturally narrow shoulders. The HUD seemed too elongated. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The pain in my abdomen sharpened, became hot and alive, unlike my numb limbs. I tried to jerk away again, to break free from this bed, and this time my arm obeyed with difficulty. My fingers slid over the cold metal of the railing. The breathing hissed louder. It sounded impatient, anticipatory. The screen trembled. One edge moved an inch, revealing a narrow strip of space behind it. Darkness. I stared, holding my breath, my eyes aching from the strain. Something pale flickered in the gap. Something like a pale, long finger, with a nail of a strange, purplish hue. It rested on the edge of the screen, as if preparing to push it aside. The monitor's beep quickened, turning into a continuous, piercing shriek. The green line remained perfectly flat. I squeezed my eyes shut, frozen in terror. This is a dream. Post-operative delirium. Morphine hallucinations. It will pass soon. A doctor will come soon and explain everything. I heard a creak, slow, drawn out. I opened my eyes. The screen was being moved. It slid smoothly across the floor, revealing what was behind it. There was no one there. At least, nothing human. There stood a shadow, but not an absence of light. It was something dense, viscous, absorbing the weak night light from the window. A tall, emaciated silhouette, bent at angles that induced nausea, long, thin limbs to many joints, and a face, or rather, what should have been a face, an elongated oval devoid of features, except in the lower part a slit of a mouth from which that same rasping, gurgling breath emanated. A trickle of something dark slowly oozed from the slit, dripping onto the floor with a soft, disgusting click. It had no eyes, but I knew it was looking at me, with its entire faceless essence. I felt that gaze like physical pressure on my skin. The monitor's shriek peaked and suddenly cut off. Silence fell, broken only by the creature's gurgling breath. It took a step forward. Its movements were sharp, jerky, like a poorly controlled marionette. It hovered above the floor, not touching it. I desperately jerked away, finally breaking free from the paralysis. I scrambled to the very edge of the bed, pressing myself against the wall. The cold plastic of the monitor pressed into my back. "Don't come closer," I screamed, and this time my voice obeyed, filling the quiet room with a wild animal terror. The creature stopped, its head tilted to the side, as if studying a strange insect. The eyeless mask was pointed right at me. The breathing grew quieter but more intense, like a predator preparing to pounce. A sound came from its mouth slit, not a voice, not a language. It was a grinding, as if stones were being crushed deep underground. But I understood, not with my ears, but with something else, deep inside, in the most ancient, primal part of my brain. Quiet, do not interfere.
What do you want? I whispered, feeling tears stream down my temples. The creature stretched out its long, bony arm. That same pale finger with the purple nail pointed, not at me, at the monitor behind my back. I turned around, frozen in an awkward, hunched position. The screen was dead, dark, but across it, like a ghost, the same flat green line was slowly crawling. And below it numbers, pulse, 0, pressure, 0 zeroths, oxygen. O.it was showing me the truth. The one the nurse had believed. The creature made the grinding sound again, mine, and then it hit me. It hadn't come for me. It had come for what was on the monitor, for my death, for those zeros. It was a collector, an orderly, the one who appears when the final alarm sounds. But my alarm hadn't stopped, and I hadn't died. I was stuck somewhere in between, and it had broken some mechanism, attracted something that wasn't supposed to see me. It took another step. It smelled of copper, old bandages, and damp earth. I recoiled, and my hand found the call button on the bedside panel. I pressed it as hard as I could, not taking my eyes off the creature. A bell rang somewhere. Muffled, distant, the creature flinched. Its faceless head snapped toward the door, then back to me. Its breathing now held rage, impatience. It was hesitating, and that was against the rules. Mine, it growled inside my head. Give it. It lunged forward. I screamed, covering myself with the blanket like a pitiful shield. Long, bony fingers with purple claws dug into the mattress next to my head. An icy cold radiated from its body. Its breath scorched my cheek, the smell of grave dampness and decay. I waited for the end, for the feeling of emptiness, for it to take what it had come for, but nothing happened. I opened my eyes. The creature was frozen above me, its mouth slit agape. A quiet, furious whisper came from it, like the hissing of dozens of snakes. It was looking through me. At the monitor, I turned around. On the dark screen, right over the green line, another one was faintly flickering, red, uneven, jumping, and below it pulsed a number, 48, then 50, then 52. That was my heart beating, my real one, alive. It was fighting, refusing to give up. The orderly recoiled. It made a sound full of pure, inexpressible disappointment and malice. Its form trembled, grew less dense, like a shadow in the sun. Footsteps and grumbling sounded in the doorway. Now what is it? It was the same nurse's voice. The creature slowly, reluctantly retreated into the corner. Its form melted, dissolving into the darkness. The last thing I saw was its eyeless gaze, full of a promise to return. And then it was gone. The nurse walked into the room, squinting in the light. Press the button again? Calm down, will you? She glanced at my monitor. The screen was active again. The green curve of the pulse was jumping confidently and evenly in time with my real heart. The numbers were within normal limits. The nurse snorted with satisfaction. See? Everything's fine. The machine fixed itself. Sleep. She left, never suspecting what had happened. I was left alone, shaking, wet with cold sweat. I looked at the calmed monitor, at that false, lulling picture, and I knew the truth. It would be back. It knew my scent now, knew I had seen it, and the next time the green line ran across the screen, be it a glitch or the real end, it would appear not as an impersonal orderly. It would appear as a hunter coming to claim its missed prey. I can't take my eyes off the monitor. Every beep sends an icy stab down my spine. I listen for every rustle in the hallway, and I know that the most terrible thing is not to die. The most terrible thing is to wait for them to come for you, and to hear in the night silence a familiar, heavy, raspy breathing right behind the thin white screen.
The second story. The doctor on his morning rounds congratulated me on the successful amputation of my leg, but when I threw off the blanket, both my legs were in place. The words hung in the sterile hospital air. thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay. The doctor, a young guy with tired but kind eyes behind thin metal-framed glasses, was smiling. He held a tablet, his finger poised to make the next note. I froze, feeling goosebumps run down my spine, washing away the remnants of anesthetic oblivion. A minor accident. Just a scratched bumper and a blow to the head on the steering wheel. A concussion at most, a night under observation for paperwork's sake. No legs, no amputations. I jerked the blanket off sharply. My 2 legs stared back at me. Completely whole, unharmed in blue hospital socks. I wiggled my toes, feeling the familiar, reassuring movement. My heart was pounding somewhere in my throat, beating a rhythm of panic. Are you joking? I rasped, and my voice sounded strange, broken. The smile on the doctor's face didn't flicker. He didn't even glance at my legs. Instead, he shook his head, his gaze sliding somewhere over my shoulder to the empty hospital bed opposite. I'm not talking to you, Mr. Henderson, he said calmly, and his words cut deeper than any scalpel. Please don't interrupt the rounds. Mr. Henderson, not Marconi. Not to me. At that very second, a sound came from under that very empty bed. A quiet, intermittent sound, like the squeak of unoiled wheels. It grew, turning into a suppressed, hysterical giggle, then into unrestrained, throaty, insane laughter. It was filled with such pure, soul-chilling joy that the hair on my arm stood on end. The doctor seemed to hear nothing. He made a note on his tablet and nodded toward the empty bed. Well, excellent. You're in great spirits, I see. The nurse will change your dressing after breakfast. The laughter behind the bed died down, replaced by quiet, contented whimpers. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from that spot. The space under the bed was plunged into a deep shadow that seemed unnaturally thick, almost solid. Doctor, I swallowed the lump in my throat. Can't you hear that? There's someone there. The doctor finally looked at me, but his gaze was different now. Polite but detached, the way you look at difficult or confused patients. Mr. Marconi, you've suffered a concussion. Confusion and minor hallucinations are within the normal range. Try to calm down. Your legs are perfectly fine, trust me. He said it softly, but his tone carried an unshakable certainty that he was the only one perceiving reality correctly. He nodded once more toward the empty bed. Have a good day, Mr. Henderson. Glad to see you're in good spirits. And he left, leaving me alone with that quiet whimpering coming from under the bed opposite. Several hours passed. Maybe an eternity. I didn't take my eyes off that bed. The room was for 2 people, but the second one, mine, was clearly unoccupied. The bedside table was empty, no personal belongings, the bed itself made with army precision. But sounds came from there. At first it was just breathing. Deep even, as if someone was sleeping. Then the rustle of a sheet, as if the sleeper was turning over. I pressed myself into the pillow, feeling paralyzing fear bind my arms and legs. It was a hallucination. It had to be. The doctor said so. Someone knocked on the door and I flinched, almost jumping out of bed. A nurse entered the room, a rosy-cheeked, vibrant woman in her 40s. She was carrying a breakfast tray. Good morning, handsome, she chirped cheerfully. How are we feeling? The doctor said you're a bit fuzzy-headed. She put the tray on my bedside table and turned to the empty bed. From underneath it came the sounds of slurping and smacking, as if an invisible mouth was devouring porridge. Wonderful. Eat up, Mr. Henderson, the nurse said, looking at the void. Look, what a lovely cottage cheese. I watched this, and my own breakfast stuck in my throat. She wasn't pretending. Her smile was genuine, directed at someone she truly saw. She adjusted a non-existent wrinkle in the blanket on that bed. Nurse, my lips barely obeyed. Please tell me, do you see him? She turned to me and her smile changed to an expression of pity. You poor thing. Don't worry, it will pass. It's just the injury. You'll see, you'll be right as rain by evening. She came over to me, checked my temperature, my pulse. Her touch was real, solid. And your Mr. Henderson is a dear. So quiet, so polite. No trouble at all. She left, leaving me in the company of a ghost happily eating his cottage cheese. The day dragged on agonizingly slowly. I couldn't sleep, couldn't read, couldn't tear my eyes away from that half of the room. The invisible neighbor behaved like a normal patient. He tossed and turned, sighed, sometimes hummed a disjointed tune under his breath. The sounds were absolutely real, tangible. They came from one specific point in space. By evening, my nerves were shot. I had to prove to myself that I was going crazy, or find another explanation. I took my glass of water and threw it with force at the empty bed. The plastic thudded against the bed frame and fell to the floor, spilling water, and immediately from under the bed came an indignant, frightened cry. A man's voice, hoarse and old. "Hey, what are you doing? Are you crazy?" I froze, stunned. This didn't sound like a hallucination. It was a real voice coming from the void. The duty nurse, the same one, ran into the room. "What's going on here?" she asked sternly. I pointed a trembling hand at the bed. "Him," he screamed. "Did you hear him?" The nurse looked at the empty bed and her face showed extreme irritation. She turned to me. "Mr. Marconi, this is beyond the pale. Mr. Henderson was sleeping peacefully and you're throwing glasses at him. I understand you're unwell, but this is unacceptable." But I didn't throw it at him. "There's no one there," I shouted, feeling the ground disappear from under my feet. "I can see you perfectly well, young man." The same hoarse voice came from under the bed, full of resentment. "A nutcase for a neighbor. Nurse, can't you move me?" The nurse sighed and walked over to the empty bed. "Forgive him, Mr. Henderson, he's not himself. We'll clean this up right away." She picked up the glass from the floor and wiped up the water with a cloth she seemed to have brought specifically for this. She soothed the void, cooing, "It's all right, no harm done. You go back to sleep." The world had turned upside down. They all saw him, heard him, communicated with him, and I was the crazy one to them, the troublemaker who couldn't see the obvious. The night brought new horrors. I didn't sleep. The main lights in the room were turned off. Only a dim nightlight by the door remained. The shadows grew long, ominous. First there was a creak, metallic, sharp. I raised myself on my elbows. The shadow on the wall from the empty bed changed. It wavered as if someone was sitting on the bed and rocking. Then, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, shuffling. They sounded right there on that floor where no one was. They walked around the bed and headed toward me. I froze, unable to move. Cold sweat streamed down my temples. The footsteps stopped a meter from my bed. I felt someone's gaze on me. It smelled of old age, medicine, and something sweetly rotten. A quiet, hoarse whisper sounded right at my ear, though I saw nothing in front of me. "Do you see me?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. My breath caught. The whisper became angry, sarcastic. "But you should. You're in my place." The footsteps retreated. I heard the sound of someone lying down on that bed. The blanket rustled. Then, complete silence. Towards morning, exhausted, I fell into a short, troubled sleep. I dreamed that I was lying on that bed, and that same doctor was standing over mine, congratulating me on a successful amputation. I scream that it's not me, but he doesn't hear. I was awakened by voices, the morning rounds. The same doctor and 2 nurses, so everything is on track, the doctor was saying, addressing the empty bed. "We'll remove the stitches in a week, and then you can go home, Mr. Henderson." He turned to me. His face was serious. "Mr. Marconi, we need to talk about your behavior. You are harassing other patients. This is unacceptable." I wasn't listening to him anymore. I was looking at the empty bed, and I suddenly understood everything. This wasn't about me, but it concerned me directly. "Doctor," I interrupted him, and my voice sounded surprisingly calm. "What happened to Mr. Henderson?" "With his leg?" The doctor frowned, surprised by the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" "You need to apologize." "Please!" The former hysteria sounded in my voice. "Just tell me." The doctor sighed and glanced at his tablet. "Gangrene, complications from advanced diabetes. The below-the-knee amputation was successful. Now the question is about a prosthesis. He kept talking, but I didn't hear him anymore. The puzzle pieces came together into a terrifying picture. They saw him. They treated him. They operated on him. But he wasn't there. His body, his physical shell, was absent. But his presence, his pain, his story remained. Tethered to this place, to this bed. They were treating a ghost, and I had ended up in his room, on his territory. And now he, this invisible old man, resentful of the whole world, whose body was perhaps long in the grave, while his consciousness was stuck here in this hospital room, had decided to socialize. Or find a new place, a new body. I was silent all day. I observed. The nurses continued to care for the invisible man. Change the dressings on his non-existent leg. Bring him food that, judging by the smacking sounds, he ate with appetite, and at night it happened again. Footsteps. They approached my bed again. This time I felt pressure on the edge of the mattress. Someone invisible was sitting on my bed, breathing. That same hoarse, wheezing breath. "I'm lonely here," the voice whispered. "They are nice, but they're not real. They can't feel me, but you can feel." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. "You're in my place. Time to switch." I felt an icy touch on my right leg, exactly like a surgeon's before an operation, when he marks the incision line. The cold penetrated through the blanket, through the skin, right into the bone. I screamed. I screamed as I had never screamed in my life. The duty orderly, a burly guy, burst into the room. He turned on the light. "What now?" he barked. "He's here. On my bed, touching me." I was gasping for air, pointing a finger at the empty space by my feet. The orderly looked there, then at me. His face twisted in disgust. "There's no one there, nutcase. Go to sleep." At that moment, from the other side of the room came a quiet, contented chuckle, the same one that had started it all. The orderly turned his head. His gaze momentarily became uncertain, confused. He seemed to listen, but then shook his head and stared at me again. "Last warning. One more performance and we'll restrain you." "Understood?" He left, turning off the light. I sat there, hugging my knees, shaking. The icy spot on my leg could still be felt. The laughter died down. Now, from over there came quiet, steady snoring. He was asleep, on my bed, in his place. In the morning, I demanded immediate discharge. I yelled, threatened, begged. The doctor, after consulting with the nurses, threw up his hands. "Your vitals are normal, Mr. Marconi. The concussion appears to have been mild, but your psycho-emotional state, we'd like our psychiatrist to examine you." It was a nightmare. They weren't going to let me go. They thought I was a violent madman, and my invisible neighbor was a model patient. I realized there was only one way out. I had to play by their rules, acknowledge him. When lunch was brought, I gathered all my courage and turned to the empty bed. Mr. Henderson?" My words sounded unnaturally loud. "I apologize for yesterday. I was not myself." Silence hung in the room. Then a displeased grumble came from under the bed. Some neighbor they picked. "A nutcase." The nurse, setting down the tray, beamed. "You see, Mr. Marconi." Wonderful. Peace and friendship. From that moment on, I began to behave normally. I greeted the void, wished it good night, pretended the light from its nightlight bothered me. The medical staff was delighted. My treatment was going successfully, and the nightly visits stopped. Now he just slept in his bed, or pretended to. Sometimes I caught his gaze on me. Invisible, heavy, studying. He was waiting. Finally, the day of discharge arrived. The doctor signed my papers, repeating that I should see a neurologist and take a course of sedatives. I was getting dressed, feeling that empty bed behind me. I knew he was watching. I hurried, trying not to look back. "Leaving?" A hoarse voice sounded behind me. I turned around. The room was empty except for me. "Yes," I whispered. "It's time for me to go." A long sigh followed. Pity. We became such good friends. "Who will talk to me now?" There was no anger in his voice, no threat. Only infinite, all-consuming melancholy that made my blood run cold. I didn't answer. I ran out of the room without looking back, flew down the corridor headlong, suppressing the desire to scream. I burst outside, and the blinding sun hit my face. I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling the tremors gradually subside. I was free. I had escaped. I walked along the sidewalk, almost starting to believe it was all over, that it was just a nightmare born of injury. At the intersection, the light turned red. I stopped. An elderly man stood next to me, leaning on a crutch. On his right leg, his trousers were tucked into a high sock, outlining the shape of a stump. He turned to look at the cars. Our eyes met, and I recognized those eyes. Tired, extinguished, hollow. The very eyes I was sure had been watching me from the void all those days. He smiled, a familiar, toothless, soul-chilling smile. "Well then," he whispered hoarsely, and his voice was audible through the street noise. "Shall we go together?" And his crutch, clattering on the asphalt, beat out that same rhythm. Thump, drag, like the footsteps of an invisible man on a hospital floor. The red light changed to green. The crowd started moving across the road, and I remained standing there, unable to move a single muscle, watching the retreating figure on crutches, feeling an icy hand squeezing my perfectly healthy, whole leg. The third story. The nurse gave me a painkiller, and a minute later I could read the thoughts of the surgeon preparing for my operation. The words hit me not as sound, but as pure, unfiltered essence bursting directly into my brain. It wasn't like hearing a voice. It was like a realization, sudden and terrifyingly clear, as if my own neurons had suddenly started processing someone else's mental clutter. The pain, the very same that just a minute ago was tearing my abdomen apart with white-hot knives of fire, was gone. Completely. Absolutely. It was replaced by a chilling void. And in that void, he began to speak. Manhattan Central Hospital. Blinking ambulance lights, shouts from orderlies, urgent night admission. I'd just had dinner at a questionable burger joint. Just a stomachache that within a couple of hours had turned into a hellish storm. Appendicitis? Peritonitis? The EMTs, frowning, shook their heads, muttered something about an atypical presentation, and rushed me to surgery. The nurse, a woman with a tired but kind face, gave me an encouraging smile before inserting the IV. "Don't worry, Jack. This is a new drug, Salanx, a miracle of pharmacology. It'll take the pain right away, and you'll stay conscious. Everything will be fine." She injected a clear liquid into the IV. A cold wave ran through my vein, and a moment later the world turned upside down. The pain was gone, but its place was taken by something indescribably more monstrous. First, it was just a hum, a low-frequency, intrusive hum, like a transformer buzzing. Then the hum broke into individual notes, words, images. It wasn't a stream. It was an ocean of someone else's thoughts crashing down on my defenseless mind. I was lying on a gurney in a narrow pre-op bay. Behind a thin wall in the next operating room, someone was preparing for work, and his brain, his most intimate, unrestrained thoughts, were invading me with terrifying clarity. "All right, let's begin. Wonder what Linda made for dinner. Hope it's not that tuna pasta of hers again. Gives me heartburn for 2 days." The thoughts were flat, devoid of emotional color. A statement of facts. The internal monologue of a man completely absorbed in routine. "So where is this appendix of his?" "Ah, there you are. God, what a mess inside. All covered in adhesions. Who let it get this bad? Liver looks like an old sponge after a party. Should suggest he sees a hepatologist later. Although no extra questions. I felt something moving inside me, in my own abdominal cavity. A cold touch of an instrument, but I felt no pain, only pressure, and this horrifying voiceover. "Someone has to fix this." Always me, like a janitor. Cleaning up other people's biological mess. Okay, resecting. Carefully. It was him, the surgeon. Dr. Evans, as I later learned from his own thoughts. 45 years old, 20 of them at the operating table. Disappointed in his wife, in his kids who don't respect him, in medicine that has turned into a conveyor belt. His thoughts were saturated with cynical boredom. Another vessel. Bleeding. I'll clamp it. Doesn't matter, not critical. It'll thrombose on its own. Extra sutures mean extra risk of adhesions. We'll tell the relatives there was extensive bleeding due to inflammation. They won't check anyway. Horror, icy and nauseating, gripped me tighter than any paralysis. He was doing something wrong on purpose. He was saving time. He was playing with my life, thinking about his stupid tuna pasta. I tried to scream, to order him to stop, to explain that I knew everything, I could hear everything, but my body was a dead weight. Silence had done its job. It took away the pain, but it also paralyzed all my voluntary muscles. I couldn't move a finger, couldn't make a sound. I was locked in my own body, as if in a coffin, with headphones piping in the scariest horror movie ever made. A live report of my own carelessly performed surgery. Well, that seems to be it. Now irrigation, wash and clean. Can't wait to get home. New series of Surgeons premieres tonight. Haha, the irony. I'll watch those actors messing around in the dirt. I felt cold saline solution pouring inside me. His thoughts flowed smoothly without tension. For him, it was Tuesday. Sutures. I could do it layer by layer, nice and neat. But why? There'll be a scar anyway. Quick. A continuous suture and done. The main thing is a sepsis. The skin will heal anyway. The needle entered the flesh. The thread pulled through. I felt every movement, every bite of the skin, but without pain, only as a distant, detached, mechanical action. And it was accompanied by a soul-chilling commentary. Oh well, not a masterpiece, but it'll do. Next. The thought hit like a whip crack. Next, I was just an object on a conveyor belt. Another problem to be quickly disposed of. The gurney was wheeled out of the operating room. The stream of Dr. Evans's thoughts began to weaken, to fade, like a radio station dying out as you drive away from the city. The last thing I caught was a thought about whether he should remember to pick up sushi on the way home, since Linda had made her pasta again. I lay in the recovery room, unable to move, staring at the white ceiling. A quiet hysteria raged inside me. I was alive. The surgery was over. But at what cost? What had he done inside me? What had he clamped? What was not critical? The paralysis gradually receded. First I could move my fingers, then my arm. My throat was still tight, but I could already make hoarse sounds. The nurse, the same one who gave me the injection, approached me. So, how are you, Jack? Did silence do the trick? No pain? Her face shone with professional pride. Doctor, I rasped, and my voice was foreign, exhausted. Dr. Evans, Oh, so you've met. He's our best surgeon. You're very lucky he was on duty. Everything went brilliantly, quickly. You have no idea how bad the inflammation was. My breath caught. She didn't understand. She only saw the result, a operated patient. She hadn't heard his thoughts. He missed something. Inside. I tried to find words to explain the inexplicable. The nurse frowned, her smile fading. She touched my forehead. Jack, that's post-operative euphoria and the residual effect of the drug. Hallucinations, confusion are possible. You need to rest. Dr. Evans did everything perfectly. She left, leaving me alone with my horror. Who would believe me? If I told them I could read minds, they'd transfer me to a psych ward instantly. The night was endless. I listened to every rustle inside myself. A twinge here, a pull there. Is this normal, or is that not critical vessel making itself known? In the morning, the rounds came, led by that very Dr. Evans. He was younger than I had pictured from his mind. Salt and pepper hair, fit with intelligent, tired eyes. The perfect picture of a doctor from an expensive clinic. So how's our patient? His voice was velvety, calm, full of confidence. Everything went well. No complications. Neat little suture. We'll discharge you in a week. He looked at me and his eyes were empty. There was nothing in them of that cynical, world-weary man whose thoughts I had heard. And then I picked up a weak, barely perceptible signal. Like static, a fragment of a thought. Need to get more sleep, these bags under my eyes. It was him, his inner voice. The silence was leaving my system. Its effect was weakening, but some neural connection once opened hadn't fully closed yet. I could still hear him, faintly, like a whisper from the next room. I stared at him, and he, feeling my gaze, frowned slightly. What's he staring at? Another hypochondriac, probably. Now he'll start asking about every stitch. Are you sure everything is okay? I forced out. His face broke into a professional, lifeless smile. Absolutely, Jack. Don't worry. Everything is under control. Of course it's under control. Should I tell him I almost nicked half his liver while digging out that damn appendix? But why scare the patient? And implicate myself? I felt everything inside me go cold. Half his liver. He didn't say anything. He just stitched me up and pretended everything was fine. I had to do something. But what? Accuse him? Say, I know what you were thinking about my liver. The rounds moved on. Evans nodded at me and left. But my receiver kept working. I heard his thoughts as he walked down the hall. The lab called about the patient in 314. Bilirubin is through the roof. Should check on that, but later after coffee. Damn, those insurance clerks again with their paperwork. I hate this bureaucracy. He was thinking about work, about papers, about coffee. And amidst this stream, fleeting, terrifying admissions of negligence that drowned in the routine like stones in a swamp. That day, I was transferred to a regular room. The effect of the drug finally wore off, and the ability to hear thoughts faded. But the silence in my head was worse than any noise. Now I was left alone with my paranoia, with the knowledge that inside me was a time bomb planted by indifferent hands. Every day I waited for something to rupture, tear, become inflamed. Every visit from the nurse with a thermometer felt like a harbinger of disaster. But the days passed, and nothing terrible happened. The suture was healing. The pain was almost gone. I was almost managing to convince myself that it was all a delusion. A terrible side effect of silence, once before discharge. Evans came by to sign my paperwork. Well, Jack, that's it. Congratulations. Take it easy for a couple of months. Diet. No heavy lifting. He handed me my file. And at that moment, completely unexpectedly, my gift returned for a second. Like a short circuit. Something clicked in my brain, and I heard his thought, crystal clear, as he looked at my test results with an indifferent expression. Lucky guy. Could have gone the other way. Need to be more careful with the electrocautery next time. He smiled at me, suspecting nothing, turned around and left. I sat on the bed, clutching the discharge papers, and the whole world around me lost all stability. It wasn't a delusion. It was real. And this man, this best surgeon, was still operating. Right now, he was probably going to another OR, to another Jack, to think about sushi and TV shows while something inside someone else bled, not critically. I was discharged. I returned to life, but I was a different person. I couldn't trust doctors. I couldn't trust anyone. I constantly listened to my own body, searching for symptoms of non-existent diseases planted in my head by his indifferent thoughts. I found out that Silex had been recalled from the market. It turned out it had a rare side effect, causing temporary, pronounced paranoid hallucinations. For the pharmaceutical company and the doctors, that was the definitive explanation. But I knew the truth. Sometimes, passing by the central hospital, I would stop and look at its gleaming windows. Somewhere in there was he, Dr. Evans, and his scalpel, and his thoughts, and I knew that the most terrible thing wasn't the pain. The most terrible thing was to know that your life, your body, is just a backdrop for someone's boring, mundane, lethally dangerous thoughts. And you are utterly powerless against this knowledge. Once on the subway, I saw him. He was riding in the same car, tired, in civilian clothes, reading something on his phone. We were standing a few steps apart. He was just a man, not a monster, not a villain, just a tired, disappointed specialist. And as the train rushed through the darkness of the tunnel, I looked at him and couldn't shake a single obsessive thought spinning in my head. and I desperately hoped he himself didn't have any silence in his blood to hear it. I wonder what he's thinking about right now. The fourth story. All the patients in my ward lay with their eyes closed and didn't move. But at night, their sheets were covered in fresh blood stains. The air in Ward 307 was thick and still, smelling of bleach, old age, and something sweetly cloying that Charles Lewis couldn't identify, but that made his stomach clench with anxiety. For him, a 40-year-old man of athletic build, used to marathon runs and boardroom battles as a financial analyst, this stillness seemed unnatural, depraved. He had been brought here after a ridiculous incident, a sharp pain in his side during his morning jog, a diagnosis of acute pancreatitis attack, urgent hospitalization. He was placed in a 6-bed general ward, and from the very first minute, something felt wrong. His neighbors. There were 5 of them. They didn't moan, toss and turn, or call for the nurse. They just lay there, perfectly still, eyes closed, hands neatly on top of the blankets. Their breathing was so quiet and shallow that Charles kept catching himself staring intently at one or another neighbor's chest, trying to detect movement. They seemed to be in a deep coma or under a massive dose of sedatives. But then why were they here, in a general ward, and not in the ICU or intensive care unit? The first night became torture for him. The pain had subsided thanks to the IV drips, but it was replaced by a primal, uncontrollable fear. The lights in the ward were dimmed, leaving only a dull nightlight by the door, casting long, dancing shadows. That's when he heard it, the squeak of wheels, slow, measured, approaching down the corridor. The door to the ward opened silently. On the threshold stood an orderly, a tall, stooped man in a white coat too big for him. His face was hidden in shadow, but Charles felt his heavy, sliding gaze upon him. The orderly was pushing a small metal cart ahead of him, loaded with something covered by a white cloth. He didn't look at Charles. He headed to the first bed, to an elderly man with grey, stubbly cheeks. The squeak of the wheels died down. The orderly froze for a few moments as if checking an invisible list. Then his hand slipped under the cloth on the cart. A quiet, metallic clang sounded like from tools. Charles, holding his breath, half closed his eyes, leaving a narrow slit. He couldn't see what exactly the orderly was doing. His back was blocking the view, but he heard a quiet, wet sound like cutting dense fabric. A restrained sigh escaping the old man's chest. The first sound Charles had heard from him the entire time. But it wasn't a sound of pain, more like relief. Then, a soft rustling, the sound of a dressing being changed, the clink of something metal being dropped into a metal tray. The procedure took no more than 3 minutes. The orderly moved to the next bed, and repeated the same thing, and again, the same set of quiet, horrifying sounds. A cut, a sigh, rustling, clanging. He went around all 5. He worked silently, methodically, with a terrifying, practiced precision of an automaton. Not a word, no unnecessary movement. When he left, wheeling his sinister cart away, Charles lay in a stupor, covered in sticky, cold sweat. He didn't sleep a wink until morning. The morning light flooding the ward brought no relief. It brought proof. A nurse, a cheerful and lively girl, began her rounds. She checked monitor readings, adjusted IV drips, and when she pulled back the blanket of the first neighbor to listen to his breathing, Charles saw it. The snow-white sheet under the old man's body was stained with scarlet, fresh smears. They showed through around the abdominal area, bright, terrifyingly real. The nurse, without changing her expression, neatly changed the sheet, wiped the patient's skin with antiseptic, applying a fresh gauze bandage over a neat, almost invisible wound under the dressing. She did it as routinely as making a bed. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. He watched as she did the same with each of his 5 neighbors. Everyone had fresh bloodstains on their sheets. Everyone had fresh wounds hidden under bandages. What's wrong with them? He rasped, barely finding the strength to speak. The nurse turned to him with a sunny smile. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Lewis. It's just drains, post-operative procedures. Everything is completely fine. Her cheerfulness was so unnatural, so detached from what was happening, that Charles felt a chill inside. She was either lying or just as out of her mind as everyone else here. But they don't move. They don't wake up, he insisted. They are prescribed strict bed rest and special medication support. Her voice became slightly harder, the smile not reaching her eyes. You shouldn't worry either. You need to rest. She quickly finished her rounds and left, leaving him alone with 5 living corpses and the knowledge that some bloody manipulations were performed on them every night. All day, Charles tried to catch the doctor's eye during rounds, tried to question the other shift of nurses. Everyone said the same thing: drains. Standard procedures, none of your business. Their eyes were glassy, detached. He was the only one who saw the madness happening. By evening, he understood. He would be the next target. Tonight, that orderly would approach his bed. Panic threatened to turn into hysteria, but Charles was not one to give up. His mind, sharpened for risk analysis and finding weak spots, began to work. Run. He was weak, tethered to an IV. Scream. Who would hear? The medical staff was clearly in on it. There was only one option left. Learn the truth. See it with his own eyes. He decided to pretend to be asleep. When lights out was announced in the department, Charles was ready. He lay on his side, facing the aisle, and closed his eyes, leaving a tiny gap between his eyelashes. His heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the quiet ward. Every minute of waiting stretched into an eternity, and then he heard it. The familiar squeak, slow, relentless, like a chariot of death approaching his bed. The door opened. A tall, stooped figure rolled into the ward against the backdrop of the dim light from the corridor. The cart, the white cloth. The orderly unhurriedly began his usual route. First bed, second, third. Charles watched him, holding his breath, feeling his muscles tense to the point of cramping. He prayed that he would just pass by, but no. After doing his gruesome work with the other patients, the orderly headed towards him. The squeak of the wheels died down right at his bedside. Charles lay still, not moving, imitating the deep, even breathing of a sleeping person. He felt a heavy, studying gaze upon him. It smelled of formalin, old blood, and something chemical and coppery. The orderly's hand reached for the cart. His fingers, long and bony, with pale, almost bluish skin, grabbed the edge of the white cloth and pulled it back, and through the slit of his squinted eyelids, Charles saw it. On the cart, there were no syringes, no medicine jars, or stacks of clean bandages. Under the cloth lay surgical instruments, shiny, sterile, clean, razor-sharp, serrated forceps, tweezers with sharp tips, and most importantly, a long, curved, mirror-polished scalpel. Its blade, even in the dim light, cast a sinister, cold glint. These were not instruments for changing drains. These were instruments for cutting, for dissection. Charles's heart stopped, then raced in a frantic gallop. He barely suppressed a scream ready to tear from his throat. His whole body tensed, ready to jump, to fight. The orderly picked up the scalpel, held it with a familiar, professional ease. His other hand reached for Charles's blanket to pull it back, and at that moment their eyes met. Charles couldn't take it. His eyes flew wide open in horror. He could no longer pretend. He saw the orderly's face, ordinary, wrinkled, with tired bags under his eyes. But the eyes were completely empty, devoid of any thought, any empathy, any humanity. They were like those of a fish washed ashore. He looked at Charles but didn't see a human being. He saw an object, material. Not a single muscle twitched on the orderly's face. No surprise, no anger at being discovered. There was only a slight, barely noticeable irritation, as if from a minor technical glitch. His hand with the scalpel froze in the air. He didn't flinch. He just stood there staring with his glassy eyes. "Don't come closer," Charles hissed, scrambling toward the wall, getting tangled in the IV line. His voice sounded weak and frightened, not at all like he wanted. The orderly was silent. He slowly lowered the scalpel, but not onto the cart. He just held it in his hand, as if considering whether to continue despite everything. Then his empty gaze slid over Charles from head to toe, lingering on the trembling hands gripping the mattress. He saw his fear, saw his resistance, and then the corners of his lips twitched into something that was meant to be a smile. It was the most terrifying thing Charles had ever seen. The orderly slowly, almost theatrically, brought a finger to his bloodless lips. Shh. A quiet, hissing sound, full of inhuman patience and promise. Then he just as slowly covered the instruments with the cloth, turned his cart around, and wheeled it out of the ward without haste. The squeak of the wheels faded down the corridor. Charles sat on the bed, trembling all over, struggling to catch his breath. Adrenaline flooded his bloodstream. He was alive. He had avoided the fate of his neighbors. But that look, that gesture, that silent shh, it wasn't a warning. It was a stay of execution. He looked at his neighbors. They lay motionless, as always. Their chests rose and fell almost imperceptibly. On the fresh sheets, just changed by the nurse after the nightly rounds, new scarlet stains were already appearing. And then the terrible truth dawned on Charles. They weren't in a coma. They weren't asleep. They were conscious. They felt everything. Every touch of the scalpel, every cut. But they couldn't move, couldn't scream. They were paralyzed, locked inside their own bodies. And every night this insane, bloody procedure was performed on them. And in the mornings their bloody linen was changed with fake smiles. And now he, Charles Lewis, knew their terrible secret. And he had become a part of this silent, motionless nightmare. His quiet neighbors, his eternal, suffering cellmates. He understood that he wouldn't get out of here, not because he was sick, but because he had seen. And now he had to make a choice. Join their eternal silent suffering, or become the next victim of the nightly visit with the cart that held not a syringe, but a large, sharp scalpel. The fifth story. Someone had drawn a small smiley face in red marker on my medical chart, and each day there were more of these drawings. I first noticed it the morning after the night they brought me to this hospital with excruciating abdominal pain. The diagnosis was gallstones. The operation was straightforward, laparoscopic, almost a joke by modern standards. Me, Michael Memphis, an ordinary accountant from quiet Grand Rapids, Michigan, was put in a semi-private room, though I had no roommate yet. I was lying there, trying to read a book on my tablet, when my gaze fell on the plastic cover of my medical chart hanging at the foot of the bed. And I saw it. A small, neat smiley face drawn in red ballpoint pen, 2 dot eyes and a neat arc of a smile. It seemed cute. Must be some kind nurse or orderly trying to cheer up the patients. I smiled back at the invisible artist and forgot about it. The next day, there were 3 smileys. They were next to the first one, just as neat, but seemingly drawn with more pressure. The red ink had slightly indented the plastic. I even showed them to Nurse Lisa, a sweet girl with freckles who was setting up my IV. "Look," I said. "Someone's made a habit of doodling on my medical history." "Cute." Lisa leaned over, looked where I was pointing, and her eyebrows rose. She looked at me, then back at the cover. Her face showed pure, genuine bewilderment. "What's cute?" she asked. "There's nothing there," I laughed, thinking she was joking. "What do you mean, nothing? Right here, 3 of them, in red pen." She looked again, even squinting, then shrugged and said with a hint of concern in her voice, "Mr. Memphis, it's probably just the pre-op meds making you see things. The cover is clean, no drawings. You should rest." She left, and I spent another 10 minutes staring at the 3 distinct red smileys looking back at me from the plastic surface. They were so real, so tangible. I could trace them with my finger, but Lisa couldn't see them. By that evening, I counted 7. They were all over the cover. Their smiles seemed slightly wider, their dot eyes more intense. A cold, sticky anxiety stirred in my chest for the first time. I tried to rub one off with my finger. The plastic was smooth. The red ink wouldn't smudge, as if it were part of the material itself. An internal pattern that had surfaced. On the third day, I woke up feeling like someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and looked first at the chart. It was covered in them. Dozens, if not hundreds, of smileys. They covered the entire surface of the cover, crawling over each other, creating an eerie, dense red pattern. But the worst part wasn't their number. The faces themselves had changed. Their smiles had stretched to incredible cartoonish sizes, reaching almost to the edges of their faces, turning into unnaturally wide, ear-to-ear grimaces. These were no longer smiles of happiness, but leers, grimaces of pure, unadulterated joy bordering on madness. The eyes remained dots, but now they stared at me with a silent, idiotic delight. Goosebumps ran down my spine. This wasn't cute. It was disgusting and frightening. I snatched the chart from its holder and, limping, my legs were like jelly after all the tests and IVs, went to the duty nurse's station. This time it was an older, stern woman named Martha. "Look, please," I almost shouted, jabbing my finger at the cover. "Can't you see this? Who is drawing this? Is this some sick joke?" Martha took the chart, held it up to her eyes, turned it under the lamplight. Her face remained completely impassive. Then she looked at me with an expression of deep professional concern mixed with mild irritation. "Mr. Memphis," she said slowly, enunciating her words clearly as if speaking to a dim child. "There are no drawings on your chart. It is perfectly clean. Here is your name, your room number, your patient ID number. Nothing else. How can there be nothing?" My voice rose to a shrill pitch. "They're everywhere. Hundreds of these faces. Look, they're staring at us." I grabbed her hand and tried to force her finger to trace one of the most horrific stretched mouths. She jerked her hand away sharply. "You need to calm down." Her voice turned icy. "And return to your room. Otherwise, I will have to give you a sedative. Preoperative stress is normal, but you must get a grip." She handed the chart back to me. I looked at it. The smileys were still there. They seemed even brighter, even more mocking. You really don't see them?" I whispered, feeling the ground give way beneath me. "I see a clean medical chart," Martha stated, "and nothing more." That day my surgeon, Dr. Evans, came by, young, confident in an impeccably white coat. He quickly scanned my test results, palpated my abdomen, said everything was ready for tomorrow's surgery. With trembling hands, I showed him the chart. "Doctor, for God's sake, tell me you see this." He cast a distracted glance at the cover and flashed his Hollywood smile. "I see someone likes you, Michael. It's good when patients are cared for. Boosts morale." He patted me on the shoulder and left. He didn't see them either. Nobody did. Only me. By nightfall, the drawings had escaped the cover. They appeared on the white wall by the head of my bed. First one, then three, then a dozen. The same red, wildly grinning mouths with dot eyes. They stared at me from the ceiling, the floor, the nightstand. The red ink seemed to seep from the walls, forming these nightmarish patterns. I sat on the bed, pressed into the pillow, covers pulled over my head, and cried from helpless terror. I understood I was losing my mind. It was the only logical explanation. Hallucinations. Psychosis induced by fear of the operation. I prayed for it to end. To just fall asleep and wake up in the recovery room, where everything would be normal, where there would be no these horrible, laughing faces. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up with a strange feeling. The room was dark, only the nightlight was on, but I felt a presence, and I heard a quiet scratching sound, like someone drawing on something rough. Slowly, afraid to move, I opened my eyes. By my bed, his back to me, sat an orderly. Tall, gaunt, in a white coat that hung on him like on a hanger. I couldn't see his face. He was focused on something, bent over my leg, which was in a cast from an old fracture, a precaution due to thrombosis risk. In his hand was not a syringe, not a thermometer. In his long, bony fingers he held a thick red marker, and he was drawing. I froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move a single muscle, couldn't make a sound. I could only watch. The orderly, with a focused, almost obsessed expression, was drawing a new, enormous, smiley face on the white surface of the cast on my leg. It was bigger than all the previous ones. It covered almost the entire outer side of my shin. The orderly carefully, lovingly traced the arc of the mouth. This mouth was of monstrous size, stretched from one edge of the cast to the other, disappearing somewhere beneath it. It wasn't just drawn in red. The marker was thick, and the ink lay heavily, glossily, and in the light of the nightlight it looked wet, sticky, almost bloody. The orderly finished drawing the nightmarish mouth and started on the eyes. 2 large, perfectly round dots. They stared right at me. Then he finished and paused for a second, admiring his work. Then slowly, very slowly, turned his head. I expected to see a monstrous face, disfigured by madness, another smiley instead of a face. But his face was completely normal. An ordinary, tired face of a man in his 50s with strong features and bags under his eyes. He looked at me. His eyes were empty, tired, like those of a person who has been doing a routine, boring job for 1,000 years. There was no malice, no madness, no joy in them. Only boredom. Our eyes met. He realized I wasn't asleep, that I saw everything, and nothing changed on his face. Not a shadow of surprise, fear, or anger. He just looked at me with his empty eyes. Then his lips stretched. Slowly, very slowly, the corners of his mouth crept upward toward his temples, stretching the skin, revealing yellow, uneven teeth. It was that smile, the very one drawn on the chart, on the walls, and now, on my cast. An unnaturally wide, ear-to-ear grimace, full of silent, idiotic delight. He didn't say a word. He just smiled at me with that dreadful, drawn smile, nodded like an artist pleased with his work, stood up, and silently left the room. I lay there, unable to move, unable to scream. I felt a weight on my leg, the weight of that drawing. In the morning, Lisa came to check my blood pressure. She was still cheerful and chatty. "So, Michael, ready for your big day?" "Oh, look," she pointed at my cast. "That's sweet. Someone left you a good luck message?" Slowly, afraid to look, I turned my eyes to my leg. The cast was clean. White, matte, untouched. No giant bloody mouth, but I knew it was there. I felt it under the bandage. I felt that drawn smile burning my skin, seeping inside, into the bone. And as they wheeled me into the operating room, and the anesthesiologist began to place the mask over my face, I saw all the doctors and nurses around me looking at me and smiling, widely, very widely, ear to ear. Their eyes were empty and bored, and on the forehead of the chief surgeon, right above his eyebrows, a small, neat, red, smiley face had appeared, as if seeping through the skin. The 6th story. Every night at exactly 3:04, footsteps and the squeak of a gurney's wheels would sound in the hallway, and it always stopped outside my room's door. It wasn't just a sound. It was the metronome of my nightly nightmare, its relentless, precise beat. 3:04 a.m. The time when the hospital held its breath, and something else awoke. The time when he came. My name is Russell Van Dyke. I returned from Iraq alive, but not whole. The war left no visible scars on me, but it burned my ability to sleep to ashes. What doctors politely called post-traumatic stress disorder was in reality a constant, exhausting state of high alert. My brain refused to shut down, refused to sink into the darkness where it could be caught off guard. That's how I ended up here in this sterile neurology ward, for medication adjustment. Essentially, they were pumping me full of a cocktail of tranquilizers and sleeping pills, trying to make me forget what my eyes had seen and my ears had heard, but no medication could drown out that sound. It started exactly at 3:04. First, measured heavy footsteps. Dull booming, as if someone in heavy, wet booties was walking down the empty corridor. They always started from the far end by the stairwell, and then the squeaking would join in. A nasty, high-pitched, shrieking squeak of unoiled wheels. A gurney. It always followed the footsteps. I would lie there, pressing into the mattress, clenching my teeth and count. 10 steps, pause, squeak, squeak, 15 more steps. Another pause. My hearing, sharpened by years of night watches and patrols, picked up the slightest nuances. I knew where the squeaky floorboard lay in the hallway, and I heard the wheel ride over it and let out a plaintive cry. And the most terrifying part, the route never changed. The footsteps and squeaking would reach my room, number 312, and stop. Right outside my door, an absolute silence would follow, lasting exactly 3 minutes. I didn't breathe during those 3 minutes. I just lay there and waited. Then the sounds would start to recede in reverse order. First the squeak of the wheels, then the heavy retreating footsteps. And by 3:10, dead silence would reign in the corridor again. I tried to complain. The shift nurse, Olivia, a sweet girl, would just shake her head. "Mr. Van Dyke, no one goes around on gurneys here at night. The orderly on duty makes his rounds at 1:30, and then there's no one until morning. Are you sure it's not?" She would meaningfully tap her finger to her temple. I was sure. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was as real as the ache in my once broken rib before rain. On the 4th night, my patience snapped. The soldier in me couldn't take the passive waiting. I had to see. I had to confirm I was right. At exactly 3:03, I threw off the blanket. The drugs made my movements sluggish. My foggy mind resisted, screaming that this was a bad idea. But I forced myself. I crept to the door, holding my breath. A cold draft and a faint smell of antiseptic came from under it. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, I pressed my eye to the round peephole. The corridor was plunged in semi-darkness, lit only by a few dim nightlights. And it was empty, no one. I was already tasting the bitterness of disappointment and the fear of a crazy diagnosis when I heard them. Footsteps, squeaking. They were already approaching. And there they were. Right opposite my peephole, the sound ceased, and I saw him. In the corridor, illuminated by the dim light, stood a gurney. An old one with a rusty frame and small, dull wheels. On it lay something oblong, covered by a white hospital sheet, its outline resembling a human body. But the most horrifying thing wasn't that. There was no one around, no orderly, no doctor, no ghost for that matter. The gurney with its mysterious load stood in the middle of the empty hallway all by itself. It was just waiting. I stared at that white mound, trying to make out something. The sheet lay motionless. No breathing, no trembling. Just a quiet, silent object. 3 minutes. It stood there for exactly 3 minutes. Then, without any visible reason, it moved. The wheel squeak resumed, and it slowly rolled back into the darkness of the corridor. No footsteps were heard, just a lonely, plaintive squeak. I crawled away from the door, drenched in cold sweat. My logic, my rational thinking, everything that had kept me sane all these years, was cracking at the seams. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. The next night I was at the peephole again. Fear had been replaced by a desperate, almost insane determination. I had to understand exactly at 3:04 the sound stopped, and this time I saw it much closer. The gurney wasn't at the end of the corridor, but just a couple of meters from my door. I could make out the rust spots on its frame, the scratches on the plastic. The sheet still hid its burden. And again, not a soul around. My heart was pounding wildly. It had gotten closer. The 3rd night of observation brought a new level of horror. The gurney was standing right at my door. I could barely see it through the peephole, just the edge of a rusty wheel and a white fold of the sheet, now centimeters away from me. I felt its presence with my skin, with every nerve ending. This wasn't just a cart. It was a threat. Mute, inexplicable, but utterly real. I told Olivia to go to hell when she started again about my anxious dreams. I demanded to speak to the chief physician, the head of the department. They politely but firmly explained that no nightly rounds were scheduled and no gurneys were used after 9 p.m. They were all parked by the elevator service room. They offered me new pills, stronger ones. I refused. I needed to be conscious. I needed to be ready. Tonight arrived with the inevitability of a verdict. I knew it couldn't go on like this. It was already at the door. There was no next step. I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, staring at the door handle. On the nightstand beside me lay a dinner knife clutched in my sweaty palm, which I'd managed to swipe during supper. It was a ridiculous weapon against what I was facing, but it gave a phantom sense of control. The clock on my phone showed 3:03. The silence behind the door was ringing. Oppressive 3:04. I froze, stopping my breath. I waited for the familiar squeak, waited for the footsteps, but there was nothing. Absolute silence. The same silence that usually followed the stop. But it had come immediately, without the preliminary sounds, as if it was already here, right outside the door, waiting for its hour. And then I understood. Tonight it hadn't stopped at the door. Tonight it had pulled up right against it. Cold sweat streamed down my back. I didn't take my eyes off the handle. Dark, matte metal, glinting in the moonlight from the window, and I saw it twitch. Almost imperceptibly, as if someone on the other side had barely touched it. My heart stopped. The handle began to turn. Slowly, unnaturally slowly, silently, despite the old mechanism that usually creaked and complained. It turned with a measured, hypnotic smoothness. I watched its shape change under my gaze, saw it turn downward in the direction of opening. This was impossible. The door was locked from the inside with a latch, but the handle turned with the same relentless certainty, as if no lock existed at all. A click. Quiet, but deafening in the dead silence of the room. The latch was retracting. Now the door was unlocked. I jumped up from the bed, clutching the knife in my trembling hand. Adrenaline cut through the veil of drugs, sharpening the world to crystal clarity. I dropped into a low stance, ready to attack, to defend, for anything. The handle completed its turn, and stopped. Nothing happened. The door didn't open. No cold draft came from under it. No breathing, no squeaking was heard. Just that turned-down handle, a silent testament that access had been granted. A minute. 2. I didn't move, frozen in tension. And then a sound reached me. Not from behind the door, from above, a quiet rustling sound, as if someone was running a hand over the door on the other side. No, not a hand. Something heavy made of fabric. Slowly, very slowly, I raised my head, and I saw, through the crack between the door and the floor, a thin strip of light. The white edge of a sheet began to intrude. That same sheet from the gurney. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, it was creeping into my room. It was dirty with yellowish stains, and it smelled. It smelled of formalin and something sweetly rotten. I recoiled, clamping my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The sheet crawled inward, alive. It was infinitely long. There was no one and nothing visible behind it, just this crawling fabric, filling the space under the door like a white, sinister tongue. It crept onto the floor of my room, spreading across it, moving toward my feet, and then I understood I had been wrong. I thought the gurney was the threat, but the gurney was just the transport. The sheet wasn't a covering. It was the entity itself, the very one that came every night, and now it was here. It was crawling into my room, silent, relentless, carrying with it the smell of death and hospital sterility, mingled into the most horrifying cocktail I had ever smelled. I retreated until my back hit the cold glass of the window. The white fabric slowly spread across the floor, coming toward me. There was nowhere to run, and then from the depths of this encroaching sheet came a sound, faint, barely perceptible, not a voice, not a whisper, but a quiet, dry squeak. The squeak of an unoiled wheel. It came from right inside that pile of fabric, as if it itself was the gurney, the very ghost, the very entity that had been knocking at my door all these nights, and now it was inside.
The first story. The ticket to Albuquerque cost exactly $75.37. That was the exact amount of change I had found in the pocket of my late husband's overcoat when I bought it on that rainy Tuesday. The conductor, taking the money, didn't look me in the eyes, and his fingers were icy, as if he had just removed his gloves. I almost pulled my hand back but caught myself in time. Rudeness is not the best companion for a journey that was already difficult for me. "Thank you," I muttered. But he had already turned away, his dark blue uniform merging with the twilight gloom of the platform. I was left standing with a thin cardboard ticket in my hand on which faded, almost washed out ink read, "Phantom Express, Car 13, Seat 4B. Irony of fate or an ominous omen." Thomas, my husband, loved ghost stories. He would have appreciated it. A gulp of cold air made me shiver. I tightened my grip on the small dark wood urn nestled comfortably in my bag. His last wish: to scatter his ashes over the Grand Canyon, where he and his grandfather had once hunted for sunrises and silence. The train stood at the platform as if it had emerged from another time. The deep, velvety black color of the cars absorbed the meager light from the streetlights, and the polished copper trim reflected the orange glow of the distant city lights. There was no fuss, no farewell kisses, no familiar hum of a crowd. Just me, this silent train, and the wind howling somewhere in the distance. I entered the designated car. The air inside was still and stale, smelling of old books, dust, and something else sweet, like wilted flowers. The salon was bathed in semi-darkness, with only a few Art Nouveau sconces casting intricate patterns of light and shadow on the walls and ceiling. The carpet runners were a deep burgundy, absorbing all sound. I counted only a few passengers. They sat motionless, scattered throughout the salon like statues. A man in a three-piece suit and a bowler hat pulled low over his forehead. A woman in a long dress with a high collar, her face hidden in the shadow of a feathered hat. Another couple young people, he in a World War I soldier's uniform, she in a simple calico dress. They all stared out the windows, where night was already gathering, but their gazes were empty, fixed on nothing. I quietly made my way to my window seat. The leather seat felt cold through the thin fabric of my dress. I pressed the bag with the urn to my chest, trying to find a drop of comfort in the gesture. The train started moving silently, without the usual jolt and clang. Just the world outside the window began to drift backward, soundlessly and smoothly, like in a bad dream. The conductor walked through the salon, checking tickets. His footsteps made no sound. He glided between the seats, and when you leaned toward a passenger, they silently handed him their equally pale tickets without looking up or uttering a word. He reached me. His fingers touched my ticket again, and again that freezing cold. "Traveling far, ma'am?" he asked in a voice devoid of timbre or emotion, only a light rustle. "Like dry leaves." "To Albuquerque," I replied, and my voice sounded unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. He nodded, slowly, as if his head were a heavy weight. "A long journey. I advise you to rest. The night will be long." He moved on, leaving me in the grip of growing anxiety. I turned to the window. The city lights had long disappeared, replaced by a featureless, black desert. The moon, full and unnaturally large, hung in a starless sky, flooding the endless expanses of Arizona with a deathly light. Sand and rocks, sand and rocks. Nothing alive. Not a single ranch light, no traces of roads. Only this soulless, majestic emptiness. I tried to read, but the letters blurred before my eyes. Sleep wouldn't come. The silence in the car wasn't just an absence of sound. It was dense, heavy, oppressive. I began to detect other sounds within it. A very quiet sigh. A grating noise, like the creaking of old wood. A whisper in which no words could be distinguished, but which made my blood run cold. I risked a look at my fellow passengers. They hadn't changed their positions. The soldier was tenderly holding his companion's hand, but his fingers weren't interlaced with hers. They lay on top, pale and motionless, like marble. The woman with the feathered hat occasionally turned her head, and the moonlight would momentarily illuminate her face. It was beautiful and utterly impassive, with eyes that held nothing but deep, bottomless sorrow. A sorrow vast enough to fill all the world's deserts. A primal horror gripped me. This wasn't just a feeling of loneliness or strangeness. It was a knowledge, instinctive and undeniable, that I was not among the living. that I was stuck in an elevator taking the wrong passengers to the other side. To distract myself, I lowered my hand to the seat beside me and touched a folded newspaper. It was yellowed, brittle, the edges crumbling. I unfolded it. The Santa Fe Sentinel. The headline read. The date, October 17th, 1923. My heart hammered in my throat. I leafed through the crispy pages until my gaze fell on a large headline on the third page. Asterisk asterisk. Tragedy in the desert. Phantom Express derailed. Nitrogen monoxide survivors. Asterisk asterisk. The article told of a luxurious private train traveling from Chicago to Los Angeles. During the night, near the Grand Canyon, a landslide had caused the train to derail and plunge into a ravine. All passengers and crew perished. Search teams were never able to find the bodies or the wreckage. The gorge was too deep and inaccessible. The train and its passengers had vanished without a trace. A list of the deceased was printed below. I scanned the names. Mr. Arthur Pennyworth, the man in the bowler hat. Mrs. Eleanor Van Doren, the woman with the feathered hat. Corporal James McCoy and his fiancée, Alice Turner. I slowly raised my head and looked around the salon. At the pale, silent figures in their old-fashioned clothes. At the conductor, frozen at the end of the car, his face now turned toward me, and in his eyes, finally visible, danced reflections of the moonlight, cold, lifeless. This was not a train. This was a hearse. A funeral procession carrying the souls of the dead to their final resting place, to the site of the crash that had become their eternal trap. They had been traveling there for 100 years. And I, a living person by some monstrous mistake, had bought a ticket for this final ride. At that moment, the train braked sharply with a piercing screech of metal. I was thrown forward. The world around me froze, then plunged into an absolute silence, even more oppressive than before. The engine fell silent. We were standing in the middle of nowhere. The same lunar landscape outside the window, the same emptiness. The passengers began to stir. Slowly, as if awakening from a century-long sleep, they turned their heads. Their gazes, filled with that same eternal sorrow I had seen earlier, were now fixed on me. I was an outsider, an intruder, a stain of warm, pulsating life in their world of cold death. The conductor moved toward me. His steps on the burgundy carpet were soundless, but each approaching step echoed in my temples like a dull beat. "We have arrived," he rustled, stopping by my seat. His icy breath touched my face. Arrived? But this is the desert. I squeezed out. The place of rest, he corrected. His white-gloved hand pointed to the window. Everyone is getting off. The passengers rose from their seats. They didn't look at each other, only at me and at the door at the end of the car. Their movements were smooth, aimless, but held an inexorable resolve. "I'm not from here," I screamed, clutching the armrests. My voice rose to a screech. "I'm alive. You have to let me go." The conductor leaned toward me. His face was a mask of polite indifference, but his eyes danced with sparks of cruel curiosity. "The ticket is purchased. The payment is accepted. The rules are the same for everyone, ma'am." He reached out his hand to me. I flinched back, pressing the bag with Thomas's ashes to me. Its wooden surface suddenly seemed the only warm and real thing in this nightmare. Suddenly, I remembered. $75.37. Such a strange amount. Change from the pocket of my dead husband's coat. A purchase on a rainy day. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a ritual. The fare for the passage to the other world. And I, unknowingly, had paid it. The passengers surrounded my seat. They didn't threaten, didn't reach out. They just stood there, silently. Their collective silence was worse than any screams. It pressed down, sapped my will, drained hope. "No," I whispered. "No, I won't get off." The conductor shook his head. "No one stays here against their will. But no one leaves either. You either join the procession or you stay here, forever, alone." He waved his hand, and the passengers as one, turned and floated toward the exit. They passed through the locked door as if through mist, disappearing into the moonlight of the desert. Soon, only the conductor and I remained in the car. Outside the window, in the deathly moonlight, I saw them. They lined up, standing facing the darkness of the chasm, which I couldn't see but whose presence I felt with every fiber of my being. The abyss that had been waiting for them for 100 years. "Last chance, ma'am," said the conductor. His figure began to lose clarity, becoming transparent. I understood what he meant. Staying here didn't just mean sitting in the car. It meant becoming part of the train. A ghost among ghosts, forever shuttling along this route of despair. A desperate thought pierced my fear. The urn, Thomas's ashes, his last wish, the Grand Canyon. We were at the destination. Only this destination wasn't for me. Gathering the last of my strength, I jumped up from the seat. "I will fulfill his wish," I said, looking into the conductor's empty eyes. I rushed to the door and flung it open. An icy desert wind hit my face. Sand crunched under my feet. Before me, a few steps away, gaped a blackness. The edge of a cliff. The abyss. The ghosts stood on the edge, ready to step into their eternal fall. I unscrewed the lid of the urn and, without looking, poured the gray ashes into the night. The wind caught them, scattering them over the chasm. "Goodbye, Thomas," I whispered Dot, and at that same moment, something changed. The air shuddered. The moonlight seemed to soften. I heard a distant, but so alive and real sound, the sound of falling water. It was the Grand Canyon. The real one. The Colorado River was flowing somewhere below. I turned around. The train was gone. In its place was only the desert, lit by the moon. But the conductor still stood nearby. Now he looked at me not with indifference, but with something resembling respect. "You fulfilled your duty," he said. His voice lost its rustling quality, gaining a shadow of something human. "He has found peace. And you paid for the ticket not only with money. You paid with the fulfillment of a will. What should I do?" I asked, trembling from cold and adrenaline. He pointed to a barely visible path leading away from the cliff. "Walk toward the sound of the water. Walk and don't look back. Dawn is near." I took a step, then another. I didn't look back, though I felt his presence fading like morning mist. I walked toward the sound of the river by feel, stumbling over stones. The sky in the east began to lighten. When the first rays of the sun touched my cheeks, I fell to my knees and wept. I was alive. I was free. 5 years have passed since then. I never told this story. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on a dark night when the wind wails especially plaintively, I think I hear the distant sound of a train whistle. And I know that the Phantom Express is still running its route, collecting those who have paid their strange price for a passage into eternity. And I just look out the window, holding a cup of hot tea, and thank fate for that dawn in the desert that brought me home. But a part of me remained forever in that car, in that oppressive silence, among the passengers whose journey will never end.
The second story. The only rule my employer gave me was deceptively simple. Do not look at the package. Just deliver this steel safe from Chicago to San Francisco. Get off on the rear platform when the train slows on the siding, and hand it to the man in the red cap. The money he offered was as astronomical as the rule was absurd. For that kind of money, I was ready to deliver the devil himself without asking questions. But he didn't warn me that there would be a ticking sound coming from it. Now, sitting in the semi-darkness of the baggage car of the Pacific Express, I was ready to give up half my fee to throw the damn thing off the tracks. But I couldn't. I am a professional. My name is Leo Vargas, and I'm the one you trust to deliver things you're better off not asking about. I've transported everything from diamonds warmed in bloody shootouts to documents that could start wars. But never before had a package spoken to me. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was quiet but persistent, like a drop of water falling on the forehead of a condemned man. It seeped through the thick steel walls of the safe, which stood in the middle of the car, chained to the floor for high-value cargo. I tried to ignore it,
buried in a worn-out detective novel. But the words blurred before my eyes, turning into a rhythmic pattern. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The train picked up speed, and the monotonous clatter of the wheels merged with the ticking into some kind of hellish, dissonant orchestra. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe deeper. Just 40 hours, Vargas. Get a grip. Just sit here like a piece of furniture and it will be over. But the ticking didn't stop. Moreover, it was changing. At first it lagged behind the rhythm of the train, then it caught up, and after an hour, I realized with horror that both sounds had merged into perfect synchrony. Tick-tock matched clack-clack. It was no longer a coincidence. It was as if something inside the safe was listening to the world outside, adjusting, learning. I stood up and walked to the barred window. Outside, the outlines of unfamiliar towns, lonely farms, and endless fields rushed by in the darkness. America was asleep, and I was awake in a steel coffin on wheels, keeping company with a ticking Pandora's box. Do not look at the package, echoed in my head. But how can you not look at a thing that insistently knocks on your consciousness? It wasn't just a sound. There was flesh to it, a sensation of life. Sometimes I thought I heard something like a wet click between the ticks, a faint hiss as if some tiny mechanical creature were breathing. By midnight, I had stopped reading. I just sat and stared at the safe. The chain wrapped around it cast strange shadows from the single dim bulb under the ceiling. The shadows moved with the sway of the car, and I imagined they were moving on their own, like tentacles. I remembered the employer's face. A man in a perfectly pressed suit, with hands that had never known physical labor. His eyes were empty like a dead fish's. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He just laid out the terms. What's inside? I asked then, breaking my own rule of not asking questions. Not your business, Mr. Vargas. Your business is to deliver it, safe and sound. The integrity of the cargo is a matter of life and death. Literally. Now that phrase was taking on a new, sinister meaning. Suddenly, the ticking quickened. It broke away from the rhythm of the wheels and rattled like a crazy metronome before an exam. My own heart responded with a panicked staccato. I jumped up, pressing my palms to my ears. Useless. The sound didn't come from outside. It came from inside me, from the very core of my fear. It lasted for a minute, maybe two. Then the ticking just as abruptly returned to its previous synchronized rhythm, as if it were just testing its boundaries. Or my nerves, that was the breaking point. The rational part of my brain, the one that made me the best in my business, screamed for me to sit still and not move. But another part, ancient, animalistic, the part that fears the unknown more than a specific threat, had already taken over. I couldn't spend another 20 hours in this torture chamber. I needed to know. I had to see. I looked around. The car was packed with ordinary luggage, suitcases, crates, boxes. But in the corner next to the conductor's tools, I noticed a crowbar and a set of heavy wrenches. The decision came instantly, washing over me with an icy calm that replaced all the previous panic. Yes, it was a breach of contract. Yes, it could cost me my reputation and possibly my life. But living with this clicking worm in my brain was no longer an option. I took the crowbar. It was cold and heavy in my hand. As I approached the safe, I felt the ticking grow louder, as if anticipating the intrusion, or welcoming it. I inserted the end of the crowbar into the gap between the door and the body. The metal groaned. I put my whole weight into it. Nothing. The safe was built to last. Then I took the largest wrench and began methodically hitting the lock. The clang of metal on metal was deafening, drowning out the hateful tick-tock for a moment. I was covered in sweat, my muscles burning, but I didn't stop. With a crack that sounded louder than any gunshot, the lock gave way. The door bounced open a few inches. The ticking stopped. A deafening silence fell, more frightening than any sound. It lasted what felt like an eternity. I froze, listening. Only the clatter of the wheels and the whistle of wind in the cracks of the car were audible. Slowly, almost reverently, I swung the heavy door open. What I saw made my mind crack at the seams. I expected a bomb, money, stolen technology, even some occult artifacts, but this was alive. Inside the safe, suspended on thick tendon-like wires, pulsated something huge, Fleshy, the color of dark cherry, it resembled a giant heart. But not a human one. Something more ancient, monstrous. Faint electrical discharges ran across its surface, and tiny gears and cylinders of brass and polished ebony were embedded into the very flesh. Mechanics fused with organics in a terrifying, blasphemous symbiosis. It was beating. Thump, 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 thump. Each beat coincided with the clatter of the wheels over the rail joints. The train was its rhythm, its life. The wires on which it hung led to a small screen embedded in the roof of the safe. Green numbers glowed on the screen, counting down the time to arrival. 14:27:15. 14 hours, 27 minutes, 15 seconds, and then it hit me. This wasn't a mechanism. This was someone's heart, magically, technologically, hellishly tied to the path of the Pacific Express. If the train slowed down, was delayed, stopped, the heart would stop. And with it, I was sure, would die whoever it belonged to. The integrity of the cargo is a matter of life and death. The employer hadn't been joking. I was overcome with a mixture of disgust and morbid curiosity. I reached out to touch the pulsating flesh, but immediately pulled my hand back. It was warm, almost hot. At that moment, the train, picking up speed on a straight section, swayed slightly. One of the gears on the heart's surface turned and the ticking resumed. But now it sounded different, louder, more confident, as if the creature knew its secret had been revealed. I slammed the safe door shut, unable to look at the abomination any longer. But hiding from the knowledge was no longer possible. I was no longer just a courier. I was a nursemaid for this thing, the keeper of its pulse. Someone's life now depended on me. I collapsed onto some crates, staring at the floor. What had I done? Now I knew, and that knowledge was an unbearable burden. Every stop, every traffic signal, every slow turn would be answered by a panicked fear in my own heart. I had to pray that the train ran on time. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I sat and listened. The ticking was now no longer an abstract torture, but the sound of a working engine on which everything depended. I began to discern nuances in its rhythm. When the train went downhill, it quickened. On an incline, it became heavier with a slight strain. It was a living speedometer. Dawn found me in the same position. The light filtering through the dirty window brought no relief. It only illuminated the ugly reality of my situation. I glanced at the screen. 6:11:02. Less than 7 hours to go. We were racing through the Nevada deserts, the sun beginning to heat the metal skin of the car. Everything was going according to plan. It was at that moment that I saw him. At first, it was just a dot in the distance. A human figure sitting on the tracks. The engineer must have seen it too, because a piercing, long whistle sounded. But the figure didn't move. The train rushed on relentlessly. The distance closed at a terrifying speed. I pressed against the window bars, not believing my eyes. It wasn't just a person. He was tied, shackled to the rails. His arms and legs were spread out like a fly in a web. He was wearing a red cap. An icy wave of horror washed over me, constricting my throat. The man in the red cap, the one I was supposed to deliver the cargo to. He was expected. He had been set up. I rushed to the car door, looking for the emergency brake cord. My hand reached for it and froze. If I pulled the cord, the train would stop abruptly. The heart in the safe would freeze. Whoever's life was tied to it would die. Who was it? A child, a woman, an innocent hostage? Or a powerful monster whose death would plunge the world into chaos? I didn't know, but I also saw the man on the rails. A living man who was facing an agonizing death. Time slowed down. The locomotive's whistle became a continuous roar of despair. I saw the man's face, his wide-open, terror-filled eyes. He was looking right at me, at my face pressed against the glass. He was shouting something, but his words were drowned by the roar of steel. The ticking behind my back was loud, clear, like a verdict. 5:59:48, 5:47. I was torn between two doors, one leading to the brake, the other to the safe with the beating heart. Save the stranger on the rails or the anonymous life linked to the cargo. Choose between the one you see and the one you know nothing about. It was torture. Every second counted. I screamed. Screamed from helplessness, from rage, from fear. But the roar of the wheels swallowed my cry too. The train did not slow down. I did not pull the brake. A few seconds before the impact, our eyes met. In his eyes I saw not just fear. I saw understanding. He knew I saw him, knew about the choice, and at the last moment his gaze held not a curse but pity. Then the inevitable happened. A dull, crushing thud. A slight tremor ran through the entire train. Something warm and sticky splattered on my window, staining it crimson. The train jerked, slowed for a moment, but then picked up speed again. The engineer must have realized that stopping would change nothing and only make the situation worse. I stood unable to move, staring at the bloody mess on the glass. A deafening silence rang in my ears, even though the train was still rumbling. A silence inside me, and then I turned to the safe. The ticking continued. Steady, confident. 5:58 on 11, but something had changed. The rhythm remained the same, but a new note had appeared in the sound itself. Swedish, triumphant, as if the heart was not just beating, but rejoicing. It had received what it wanted. A sacrifice. I walked over to the safe and swung the door open again. The pulsating organ now seemed larger, more saturated. The color had become more scarlet. The gears turned more smoothly. And on the small screen next to the countdown, a new line had appeared. A word spelled out in green pixels. Gratitude. I vomited. I sobbed, banged my head against the steel wall of the car, but I couldn't drown out that ticking. It was now a part of me. I had become an accomplice. I had made a choice. I had let a man be killed to preserve the life of this monster. The remaining hours of the journey became my personal hell. Every tick echoed in my soul with the memory of that impact. I saw his face, his red cap torn to shreds. When the train finally began to slow down approaching San Francisco, I looked like a ghost. I mechanically unhooked the safe and dragged it to the rear platform. The train stopped on a remote siding. I stepped onto the ground, barely able to stand. There was no one around, just the ocean wind and the cries of seagulls. I waited. Waited for the man in the red cap, knowing he would not come. His death was part of the ritual. The price for keeping that heart beating. But after a few minutes, the man in the perfect suit, my employer, stepped out from around the corner of the depot. His face was impassive. He was leading a little girl about 7 years old by the hand. She was pale with huge sad eyes. "Is the cargo intact?" he asked, not looking at me. I nodded silently, unable to utter a word. He walked over to the safe, opened the door a crack, and grunted in satisfaction. The girl timidly reached for the pulsating heart. "Daddy, is it pleased?" She whispered, "Yes, dear. It is pleased. Now you will live a long, long time." He turned to me and held out an envelope of money. I didn't take it. What
was that?
I exhaled. Who was that man on the tracks? The employer looked at me with his empty eyes. "The price, Mr. Vargas, just the price. Every beat requires energy. Every extension of life requires a sacrifice. You did your job. Forget this." He took the girl's hand and they walked away, rolling the safe behind them. I remained standing, listening as the ticking gradually faded into the distance until it was drowned out by the city noise. But I knew it would never fall silent for me. It would tick in my dreams, in moments of quiet. It would remind me of the price of my choice, that I had become a part of this mechanism of death and life extension. I did not forget. And I never will. Tick-tock, tick-tock, it is always with me, in the trunk of my car, in a dark corner of the room, in the depths of my own fear-filled heart. It is looking for a new victim, and I know that one day I will have to choose again. The third story. My 3-year-old daughter pointed down the aisle and said her first word of the day, "Clown." I turned around, but there was no one there. Only an endless succession of identical seats receding into the haze at the front of the California Zephyr train. The glass doors at the end of our car reflected the faded interior, creating an illusion of even more space. We had been traveling through the Rocky Mountains for 6 hours, and the monotonous rhythm of the wheels, seemed to have swallowed all sound, including the voice of my little Lisa. "There's no clown." "Sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I reached for a paper cup of cold coffee. This trip was my desperate attempt to bring a shred of normality back into our lives after Sarah's death. The doctor had said a change of scenery would do us both good, especially for Lisa's Eulalia, the stubborn silence she had sunk into after her mother's funeral. Lisa didn't argue. She just stared into the fog outside the window, her tiny fingers clutching the hem of her doll's dress. I sighed, looking at her reflection in the glass. She looked so much like Sarah. The same ash blonde hair, the same serious gaze of large gray eyes. "The clown is funny," she said quietly a few minutes later. My heart skipped a beat. It was the first coherent sentence in the last 3 months. Not just a word, but a sentence. But its content made my skin crawl. "Where's the clown, Lisa?" She kept staring out the window, but her gaze was empty, as if she were seeing something inside herself. "There, in the next house." He's waving at me. "In the next car?" I clarified. She nodded and a faint, barely noticeable smile appeared on her lips. The very smile I hadn't seen in an eternity. And that smile was dedicated not to me, but to some imaginary clown. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that she was finally talking, and anxiety from the content of her words. Children invent friends, that's normal. But here, in this metal cocoon speeding through the mountain emptiness, her fantasy seemed sinister. Deciding to check, I stood up. "Do you want to go see him?" Lisa shook her head sharply. "No, he's only for me." He said adults scare him. An icy needle of fear pricked my chest. "He said?" "He whispers," she whispered back, mimicking the invisible interlocutor. Very quietly, that was enough. I needed to make sure that a harmless passenger in bright clothes was sitting in the next car, one whom a child's imagination had turned into a clown. Or more likely that there was no one there, and this was just a breakthrough from Lisa's subconscious. "I'll be right back, okay?" I ruffled her hair. She stared out the window again as if I had already disappeared. I pushed the heavy glass door at the end of the car. It slid open silently, letting me into a small vestibule and then into the next car. The interior was identical to ours. Blue seats with gray headrests, modest tables, luggage racks. The passengers sat motionless. Some dozed, leaning against the window. Others read. No clowns. I walked through the entire car and found myself in the next vestibule. And again I pushed the door. The next car, the same. I walked through it, and another one. By the fourth car, I began to feel a slight unease. The California Zephyr is a long train, but not that long. I should have reached the dining car, or at least first class by now, but the cars were identical. Identical down to the smallest details. The same seat patterns, the same curtains on the windows, the same passengers frozen in identical poses. I started looking closely at the people. A man in a cowboy hat sleeping by the window. An old woman knitting something endless. A young guy with headphones. I had seen them before. In one of the previous cars. I was sure of it. I quickened my pace. The 15th car? The 20th? I lost count. I stopped to catch my breath and looked out the window. Instead of the majestic mountain ranges that should have surrounded the train, a milky white maelstrom raged outside. Thick, impenetrable fog through which not a patch of land or sky was visible. It felt like the train was floating in a void. Panic began to rise in my throat, cold and sticky. I turned to run back to Lisa, but after passing through several cars, I realized I couldn't find ours. They were all the same. I tried to remember our seat number, but my mind was blank. I looked at the passengers' faces. They seemed waxy, lifeless. Their chests didn't rise and fall with breath. They didn't blink. I ran. The doors swung open silently before me, revealing new perspectives of the endless blue salon. My lungs were burning. I screamed, "Lisa!" But the sound of my voice was swallowed by the thick, sound-absorbing atmosphere of the cars. It seemed even the clatter of the wheels had become muffled, as if we were moving through cotton. Suddenly, overhead, from the speakers that had been silent until then, a soft click was heard, followed by breathing. Then a quiet, frightened whisper. I recognized that voice, Daddy. It was Lisa. Lisa, where are you? Speak louder, I yelled, gasping for air. He says, "You're going the wrong way." Her voice trembled. "You're getting further away." He's laughing, Daddy. His laugh is so quiet, I froze, drenched in a cold sweat. Who's laughing, Lisa? The clown? In response, there was only quiet, soundless crying, and then a new voice. A gentle, Swedish, creaky voice like an unoiled door. It was barely audible, as if the speaker had pressed their lips right against the microphone. "Don't interrupt our game, Daddy. We're here, in the very first car, where the fun begins." I rushed forward in the direction the train was originally heading, towards the first car. I didn't know what that meant, but it was the only clue. The cars flashed by like frames of a looped film. The fog outside the windows thickened until it became absolutely black. It felt like we were rushing through cosmic emptiness. And again Lisa's voice from the speakers interrupted by sobs. "He's not a real clown, Dad. His face, it's waxy, and it's slipping. And underneath, there's nothing underneath." The creaky voice hissed. "Not true, little girl. Underneath is an eternal smile. A smile that will never end. Like this trip." I ran until my legs gave way and I collapsed onto a seat in one of the countless cars. I was trapped. This train wasn't taking us to California. It was taking us somewhere beyond the boundaries of reality, into a trap outside space. And my little girl, my Lisa, was left there alone with the thing that was pretending to be a clown. I covered my face with my hands, trying to stifle the horror tearing me apart from the inside. I had abandoned her. I left her alone with that monster because of my own stupid curiosity. Suddenly, the train jerked and began to slow down. The screech of the brakes sounded like heavenly music. I jumped to the window. The fog began to thin. The outlines of a platform emerged. We were arriving at a station. Hope, wild and reckless, flared within me. I rushed to the nearest doors, ready to jump out onto the platform and run back along the train to find Lisa. The train came to a complete stop. The doors hissed open. I jumped out onto the concrete platform and turned around. My heart sank. The train was short, only 7 cars. I was standing at its very tail. I could see its entire length. To infinity. So it was delirium? A hallucination from fatigue? I ran along the train looking in the windows. In the 3rd car from the end I saw her. Lisa. She was sitting in her seat, still looking out the window. There was no one next to her. Gasping for breath, I burst into the car. "Lisa!" She slowly turned her head towards me. Her face showed neither fear nor joy, only emptiness. "The clown is gone," she said indifferently. "He said it was time for him to go to the next station." I grabbed her in my arms, holding her so tightly I thought I might break her. She was real, alive. I cried, kissing her hair, muttering words of relief. "What station was that?" I asked the conductor passing by. The man looked at me in surprise. "What station? We didn't stop anywhere. We're running late. The next stop is only in 2 hours." An icy cold gripped me. I looked at Lisa. She was smiling her new strange smile, too wide for her little face. "Daddy, can we stay?" she asked in her quiet voice. "I like it here. He said we can ride for a long, long time, until we get bored." I looked at her reflection in the window. And behind her reflection in the black emptiness of the night, for a moment I thought I saw another face, pale with a painted, unnatural smile and empty eye sockets. It flashed and disappeared. The doors closed. The train started moving, and I understood that we were not getting off. We would never get off, because the clown hadn't left. He had just stopped being visible. To me. But he remained here, in this car, on this train which had become our eternal cage. And my daughter kept looking out the window, quietly humming a tune I was sure no one had ever taught her. The 4th story. Every night at exactly 3:04 a.m., the Kresnaya Strela Red Arrow train would rush past my backyard. And every night I saw in the same window of the same carriage a woman's face. She looked directly at me, her hand pressed against the glass in a gesture I couldn't decipher. Yesterday I bought a ticket for that train. It started exactly a year ago. On that first lonely night after Sveta had packed her things and left me for someone who, as she put it, doesn't stare out the window at passing trains. He looks at her. The house was empty, and its silence was broken only by the growing rumble of the Krasnaya Strela, traveling from St. Petersburg to Moscow. That night I stepped onto the porch for a cigarette, and my gaze automatically slid over the flickering lights, and then I saw her. A Platz-Cartney carriage, the third or fourth window from the end. The light inside was dim, but it was enough. A woman, dark hair pulled back, a pale, almost translucent face, and eyes, huge, filled with such bottomless despair that it took my breath away. Her palm was flattened against the glass, fingers slightly splayed. It seemed she wasn't just looking, but peering into my darkness, searching for some sign of life. The train rushed past, leaving behind only a vibration in the ground and a strange heaviness in my soul. I chalked it up to fatigue, loneliness playing a cruel trick. But the next night at exactly 3:04 I was standing on the porch again, and she was there, in the same window, the same gaze, the same hand on the glass. It became a ritual, my sick secret rendezvous with a ghost of steel and light. I stopped fighting insomnia. I waited for it. I bought a telescope to see the details. I tried to understand her gesture. Was it a warning, a plea, or a farewell? I started keeping notes marking the slightest changes, but there were none. Everything was identical, eerily precise like a well-oiled mechanism. Her stillness was frightening. She didn't blink, didn't move until the train was out of sight. The neighbors would have whispered if they'd known. Mark lost his mind after his wife left. Stares at trains all night. But I didn't care. That woman in the window had become the only constant in my crumbling life, an obsession. And so, exactly 1 year later, I cracked. I had to put an end to it, to confirm she was a product of my sick imagination or to learn the truth. I bought a ticket for the Krasnaya Strela, the night train. My seat was in carriage number 9. I had specifically aimed for the window that, by my calculations, should be the one. Boarding the train felt like stepping into another reality. The smell of disinfectant, Lavsan, and something Swedish, the muffled hum of voices. I found my carriage, climbed the steps, and my heart started pounding like a madman. I walked down the corridor, counting the compartments. There it was, seat 37 by the window. It was empty. Across from it, by the aisle, an elderly man was already sitting, unpacking a sandwich in a paper napkin. I nodded silently to him and sank into my seat. The seat was hard, cold. I put my backpack on my lap and stared out the window. The glass reflected a pale, tense face. My face, the train started moving. I waited. I waited for the woman to appear. But the seat opposite remained empty until well after we left the city. Then it was taken by a student with headphones. She sat until Tver and got off. Then a conscript soldier. No woman with a pale face and a palm pressed to the glass. Despair began to creep up on me. So I really was going crazy? For a year I had built my life around a mirage. When the conductor, a woman in her 50s with a tired but kind face, came by with a tea kettle, I took a chance. I stopped her. "Excuse me," I wanted to ask. "This seat by the window. Does a certain woman usually travel here? Young, dark hair, very pale?" The conductor, named Tamara Ivanovna, poured tea for the soldier and turned to me. "Why, do you know her?" "No, I mean..." "I saw her from my window. She's always in this carriage, in this window. Exactly at 3:04. Tamara Ivanovna's face changed. The tired kindness was replaced by wariness and then by outright pallor. She put down the kettle and sat on the edge of the seat next to me, lowering her voice. "Listen, young man, maybe you shouldn't be on this train. The next stop is in half an hour. Get off. Forget about it." "What are you trying to say?" An icy ball tightened in my stomach. She looked around as if afraid of being overheard. A year ago, on this very stretch between Tver and Moscow, a passenger jumped from this carriage. A young woman. From this compartment. They said it was over an unhappy love affair. She was sitting in your seat. And before she sat by the window the whole time, her hand pressed against the glass, just like you described. The world swam before my eyes. So that's who I had seen. A ghost. I had seen a ghost. But why me? Why was she looking right at me? Did you find her? I managed to exhale. Tamara Ivanovna shook her head, her face sorrowful. The train was at full speed. The engineer didn't even feel anything. They only noticed in the morning that the window in the vestibule was slightly open. And they never found her. Case closed. As an accident. She stood up and put a hand on my shoulder. Get off at the next stop. Don't tempt fate. These are bad places, but I couldn't get off. Now I knew. I hadn't seen a hallucination. I had seen an echo of a tragedy, and I needed to wait for 3:04 to see the place where she had disappeared. Maybe her soul wanted to tell me something. Maybe she needed help. The train raced through the sleeping country. I didn't sleep, staring into the black mirror of the window. The hands on my watch relentlessly approached the fatal mark. 2:50. Firstly, the compartment was quiet. The soldier was dozing, leaning against the wall. I felt goosebumps running down my spine. At 3:03, the train began to pass the familiar area. I recognized the outlines of the hills, a lone farm in the distance. It was the very spot, exactly the same. My heart was pounding like a bird beating against its cage. Furnisure. I stared intently at the reflection in the glass, expecting to see the pale face of the dead woman behind my back. But there was no one there, only the sleeping soldier. And then I felt an irresistible, irrational desire to sit as she had sat, to press my palm against the cold glass, to look in the direction from which I had always watched her. From the direction of my house. I slowly raised my hand and pressed it against the glass. My palm instantly became damp from condensation. I stared into the blackness of the night, trying to make out the lights of my house, the porch, my own figure, and I saw. At first it was just a shadow, then a silhouette. And then as the train rushed past my property, the light from the carriage fell on the yard and I saw myself. Myself, standing on the porch with a telescope in my hand. My own face distorted by horror, eyes wide with incomprehension and fear. And my own hand, was pressed against the glass from the outside. I was looking at myself. This was not a ghost from the past, it was a warning from the future. The time loop had snapped shut. I hadn't seen a dead woman. I had seen myself, the one who would die here on these tracks exactly 1 year after her, the one who would jump from this train in despair. I had been obsessed not with her ghost, but with a vision of my own death. The horror I had seen in the eyes of that other me was so all-consuming that I screamed and jerked away from the window. The soldier woke up. "What's wrong with you?" he grumbled sleepily. I couldn't utter a word. I was shaking as if with a fever. I had seen it. I had seen my end. And the most terrible thing was that I understood the inevitability. I had boarded this train to break the loop, but instead I had only drawn myself deeper into it. The train passed my house. The vision disappeared. Outside the window there was only night again. But I knew that I was now doomed to go out onto the porch every evening and wait for 3:04. To wait for the train in whose window I would see my own face, full of mortal horror. And one night, exactly 1 year from now, I wouldn't just be standing on the porch. I would be sitting in this carriage, and my hand would be pressed against the glass, and I would be looking at myself from the past, just as I was now looking at myself from the future. A time loop isn't a circle, it's a spiral. It draws you in slowly, inexorably. And the most horrible thing is the awareness. The awareness that your worst nightmare is not a ghost from the outside. It's you, your own reflection in the window of a train rushing towards a cliff. And you can no longer get off because you are already part of the route, part of this endless night flight to your own demise. The fifth story. The railroad dispatch service in Nevada received the last message from freight train number 88. What the hell is crawling on top of the train? And then dead air. But the real horror began afterward, when other trains started passing through tunnel number 77. Those words, shouted into the ether by engineer Frank Morris, became his epitaph. His voice was strained, hoarse with adrenaline, and the last word, "from the top," turned into a drawn-out scream cut short. In the dispatch center in Reno, silence fell. broken only by the steady crackle of static. The dispatcher, a young woman named Sarah, tried to raise train number 88 3 times. The only response was a tomb-like silence. The search and rescue operation yielded nothing. The Union Pacific freight train, carrying steel beams from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles, had vanished without a trace. It had entered tunnel number 77, drilled through the Black Rock Range, and never exited. Inside the tunnel, they found no wreckage, no signs of breaking, not a drop of oil. Only thick, impenetrable darkness and the smell of cooled stone. The police, the FBI, railroad inspectors, all were baffled. 5 crew members and hundreds of tons of steel had evaporated. The incident was attributed to unexplained circumstances, and the tunnel was temporarily closed for investigation. But economic pressure was too great. 2 weeks later, after superficial checks, tunnel number 77 was reopened. The first train scheduled through was the high-speed passenger train Desert Wind. That's when the real nightmare began. The engineer of the Desert Wind, a veteran with 30 years of experience named Hector Ramos, made contact as his train approached the tunnel entrance. "Reno, this is Wind. Entering 77. Comes will drop as usual. Copy, Wind. Waiting for you on the other side," replied Sarah, who was on duty that shift. The connection, as expected, cut out the moment the train's nose dove into the black maw of the tunnel. 50 seconds, the standard transit time. Sarah watched the stopwatch. On the 48th second, noise returned to the speakers, first just white noise, then through it, fragments of a voice. Sarah leaned closer. It wasn't Hector's voice. It was the familiar, bone-chillingly familiar, panicked voice of Frank Morris from train number 88, crawling on top of the train. God, it's big, and again dead air. And immediately after, the clear, confident voice of Hector Ramos, "Reno, Wind." Exited the tunnel. All good, Sarah was stunned. She tried to ask Hector if he'd heard anything. He was just perplexed. "Quiet, Sarah, just the rumble of the wheels, like always in tunnels." At first they thought it was an equipment glitch, some kind of recording error that had accidentally leaked into the channel. But the next day, the same thing happened with a coal freight. And again, for a few seconds after exiting the tunnel, the same fragment of the panicked transmission from number 88 played over the air. Only this time it was a fraction of a second longer. After the word "it," and a deafening screech of tearing metal was heard, as if a roof of a carriage was being peeled open like a tin can. The news spread through Nevada's railroad community like wildfire. Engineers started getting nervous. Tunnel number 77 was nicknamed Echo Canyon. Engineers, one after another, began refusing routes that went through it, demanding a reinvestigation of the number 88 disappearance. The company management was furious. Delays were costing a fortune. They sent their own technicians who checked all the repeaters, cables, and equipment on the trains and in the dispatch center. No malfunctions were found. The recording was not located on any servers. It existed only over the airwaves in those few seconds after exiting the tunnel. Then, under strict supervision, a diagnostic train with scientists and state-of-the-art equipment was sent through the tunnel. They recorded the entire spectrum of radio waves. The results shocked everyone. When the train exited the tunnel, sensitive microphones picked up something that shouldn't have been. Besides Frank's voice, other sounds were audible in the channel. Unhuman screams, full of such agony that it made the researchers' blood run cold. Creaking and crashing that acoustic analysis identified as the sound of steel being crushed with incredible force. And the most terrifying, a heavy, ragged, wet breathing. It sounded right into the microphone as if someone's lungs were torn. But the creature was still trying to breathe. And with each new train passage, the voice grew longer and clearer. It now started not from the middle of the phrase, but from the very beginning of Frank's last message. "Reno, do you copy? Something's wrong. On the roof." "What the hell is crawling on top of the train? God, it's big, Sound of tearing metal. "Ah, no! Get away, unintelligible, please." Heavy breathing. "They're all dead. It's looking at me. It's breathing." Panic among the railroad workers peaked. Work through tunnel number 77 was completely paralyzed. The company suffered colossal losses. Federal authorities had to step in. A historian named Dr. Alan Crow, a specialist in the cultures of Nevada's indigenous peoples, was brought into the investigation almost by chance. Reviewing old maps and surveyors' reports from the time of the railroad's construction in the late 19th century, he stumbled upon an interesting document. In the journal of the engineer who built tunnel number 77, there was a brief, almost casual entry. Strange bones found during excavation. Resemble human, but too large. A shaman from the Paiute tribe warned we were disturbing the ancient sleep of the Great Spirit that lives in the stone. Ignored him. Behind schedule, Dr. Crow went to the reservation, found the tribal elders. After much persuasion and observance of rituals, one of them, a very old man named Standing Bear, agreed to speak. His eyes, cloudy with age, looked through Alan deep into the centuries. "You have disturbed that which should not awaken." The old man's voice was a whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves. "It is not a spirit. Spirits move on. This is ancient life. That which was here before men, before buffalo, before the earth itself. It slept in the stone in the very heart of the mountain. Your explosions woke it. It is hungry, and it is lonely, but what is it? And why do we hear this voice?" asked Alan. "It is trying to speak. Its voice is not a sound heard by ears. It is born not in a larynx, but in the very void, in the silence between worlds. Your iron snakes. Their loud cries, he meant radio waves. They create a bridge, for a moment. It uses this bridge to send its cry, the cry of the one it consumed. His fear, his last moment, it absorbed them like a sponge. And now it reproduces them, trying to call out, to understand, to make contact. Contact? But it kills. A child reaching towards an anthill also does not understand it is breaking fragile lives." The old man shook his head. "For it, your trains are just flashes of noise in the eternal silence of its world." It tries to answer. But its answer is death. Its nature is such. It is not evil, it is just different. Alan Crow returned with this knowledge. The report was delivered to the management. A creature living in the stone. An ancient predator trapped in the non-Euclidean space of the tunnel. It is invisible, intangible in our understanding, but it can interact with matter on a quantum level, distorting reality and consuming anything that falls into its trap. The radio waves of passing trains momentarily stabilize this anomaly, allowing the echo of the last tragedy, the agony of train number 88, to seep into our world. The only possible decision was made. Tunnel number 77 was to be permanently sealed. Concrete walls several meters thick were erected at both ends. The surrounding area was declared a restricted zone under the pretext of geological instability. But sometimes, very rarely, when a storm rages in the mountains and the atmosphere is charged with electricity, radio amateurs on the outskirts of Reno pick up strange signals on their headphones. Fragments of panicked messages, the screech of metal, and heavy, ragged breathing. It has grown quieter but clearer, and new words have appeared in it, words that weren't in the original recording, as if the creature practicing has learned to form them from fragments of others' thoughts. Through the noise and static, a whisper full of ancient, non-human longing comes through. "Where are you? Why don't you answer? I am here. I am always here. Let me out." And the most terrifying question, one that freezes the blood, is this pain? What I feel. Is this called pain? The tunnel is sealed, but the creature inside is not dead. It is learning, and every year, its voice on the airwaves becomes more and more intelligible. The sixth story. A ticket for the private night express Silver Moon cost a fortune, but a memo was attached to all tickets. It contained only 3 rules. Never leave your compartment after midnight. If the train stops in an open field, close the curtains and do not look outside. If you hear 3 knocks on your door, do not respond under any circumstances. I smirked. I broke all 3. My name is Arthur Vanderweide. If the surname sounds familiar, it's because you've probably flown on our planes, use our internet, or drink water from our bottles. The world is a playground for people like me, and its rules are merely annoying obstacles created for those who cannot afford to ignore them. The trip on the Silver Moon was my latest whim. Too much buzz in the press about this exclusive game for billionaires crossing the Alps in unimaginable luxury. My yacht had bored me. The private jet induced yawns, and I decided to indulge in retro glamour. The train was indeed a masterpiece. Polished mahogany, chrome details, velvet sofas. My compartment resembled a suite at the Ritz, only on wheels. The minibar contained Cristal champagne, and on the table lay that very memo, elegantly printed on heavy parchment paper. I skimmed through these 3 points and snorted. Obviously part of the show, creating an atmosphere of mystery for bored tycoons. A nice try. My neighbor in the carriage, a certain Herr Müller, a German industrialist with a face like a dried pear, took the rules seriously. "Have you read it, Herr von der Weide?" he asked at dinner, looking at me sternly over a glass of Burgundy. "Oh yes," I grinned. "A charming bedtime story. Don't you think we're a bit too old for such games?" "This is not a game," Miller snapped. "There are laws here. They should be obeyed. Laws exist to be challenged, my dear, or to pay off those who bypass them." Miller shook his head and didn't bring up the topic again. There was something in his eyes that I readily took for fear. It only amused me. After dinner, I returned to my compartment. The train raced on, swaying softly, lulling the passengers. I finished my cognac and glanced at the clock. 1:15. Perfect. The goal of my little rebellion was simple. To get to the baggage car where, rumors had it, this train was transporting a batch of rare Burgundy from the personal cellar of some emir. I wanted to uncork a bottle right there, maybe take a picture for Instagram with the hashtag, "Rules are for losers." The thought that I was breaking some stupid prohibition gave the enterprise a special piquancy. Right at midnight, I stepped out into the corridor. Violation of rule number 1. The corridor was empty and bathed in a ghostly half-light. Night lights cast long shadows. The air was still and thick. I headed towards the rear of the train, whistling softly to myself. The floor beneath my feet was springy, the carpet muffling my steps. All the compartments were locked. Not a sliver of light under the doors. It seemed the entire train except for me was fast asleep. And that's when I noticed something strange. The windows I passed showed no reflection of the carriage's interior. Not me, not the corridor, not the soft light. Instead, beyond the glass swirled an absolutely black, thick gloom. Not the night darkness with silhouettes of mountains or trees, but a dense, velvety void, as if the train was speeding through a cosmic vacuum. I stopped and pressed my face against the cold glass, trying to see something. No stars, no moon, no lights of distant cities, nothing, just darkness. But that wasn't the worst part. From time to time, in this blackness right along the train's path, strange shadows drifted past, tall, twisted, of non-human proportions. They didn't walk or fly. They glided like shadows from non-existent torches. Sometimes they appeared in the windows for an instant, and I thought I saw the outlines of overly long limbs, curves of spines defying anatomy. These weren't reflections. This was something outside. Violation of rule number 2 was already in the air, even though the train hadn't stopped yet. An inexplicable anxiety gripped me. My self-confidence began to melt, yielding to an ancient animal instinct. What if Muller was right? What if this wasn't a show? I quickened my pace, deciding to carry out my plan and return to the compartment as soon as possible. It was at that moment that the train shuddered and stopped. The braking wasn't sharp, but somehow unnatural. As if we had driven into something viscous that absorbed our inertia. The rumble of the wheels ceased and a ringing, absolute silence fell. I looked out the window. The same impenetrable darkness. The train was standing, in the middle of nothing. Rule number 2 surfaced in my memory with crystal clarity. If the train stops in an open field, close the curtains and do not look outside. But we weren't in a field. We were in pure, absolute blackness. Logic suggested the rule didn't apply, but fear, cold and sticky, whispered that it was much worse. Curiosity, my main vice and driving force, overcame fear. I walked to the nearest window and slowly, almost against my will, drew aside the heavy velvet curtain. My heart sank and froze. We were standing on a plain, but it wasn't any land I knew. The surface was flat as a table and stretched to the horizon, merging with the black, starless sky. And on this plain, as far as the eye could see, stood them, a crowd of silent, desiccated figures in rags. There were hundreds, thousands of them. They stood motionless, their faces hidden in deep shadows beneath hoods. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. Watched the train. Watched me. Their postures were unnatural, as if their bones had been broken and fused back together at strange angles. Long, crooked fingers hung from their sleeves. They emanated not evil, but something much more ancient and monstrous: indifference. The indifference of the universe to a tiny, insolent insect that dared to draw attention to itself. I recoiled from the window, gasping for air. My hand trembled. I realized I had made a fatal mistake. These rules, they weren't part of the entertainment. They were survival instructions. A shield, I rushed back to my compartment. The corridor, which a minute ago had seemed short, now stretched into an endless labyrinth. My footsteps on the soft carpet sounded deafeningly loud in the dead silence. I burst into my compartment, slammed the door, and leaned against it with my back, trying to catch my breath. And then came the knock. Not loud, not aggressive. Precise, measured, like a metronome. 3 distinct knocks on my compartment door. Knock, knock, knock. Rule number 3 flared in my brain like red-hot iron. If you hear 3 knocks on your door, do not respond under any circumstances. Blood pounded in my temples. My entire being, every cell in my body screamed to be silent, to hide, to play dead. But the remnants of my inflated pride, my contempt for any prohibitions, raised their heads. This was a trap for simpletons. Someone or something was testing my strength. And I, Arthur van der Weide, was not going to fail this test. A stupid, suicidal smirk touched my lips. I took a deep breath and said clearly, loudly, with defiance, "Who's there?" The knocking stopped. A silence even more oppressive than before descended. I froze, listening. Nothing. Only my heart pounding wildly. I felt a surge of pride. See, it's all theater. I was stronger than their stupid superstitions. That surge lasted only an instant. Then my compartment door shuddered. Not from a blow, but as if from an incredible quiet pressure. The metal frame creaked, then cracked. I jumped back from it, staring in horror. The latch snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The massive wooden door tore from its hinges and crashed to the floor inside the compartment, with a dull thud. And at the same moment, a wave of similar sounds rolled through the entire carriage. Cracking, clanging, dull blows.
All the doors.
Every single one, silence returned. Deep, all-consuming, and then I heard it. A barely perceptible rustle, not footsteps in the usual sense, but a light, shuffling movement, as if someone was dragging dry fingers across the velvet carpet. It was approaching. From it came a faint smell of dust, old parchment, and distant cold stone. And through this rustle, I heard a quiet, contented purring. It was low, deep, emanating not from a throat, but from the very gullet of the universe. There was no malice in this sound, no hunger. There was satisfaction, like a cat that had finally reached the mouse trapped in a jar. I retreated to the farthest corner of the compartment, pressing myself against the wall. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't make a sound. My arrogance had evaporated, leaving only pure, undiluted horror. The rules were not for my comfort. They were for my protection, and now the protection was gone. The door was open. The rustling footsteps stopped in the doorway. A shadow, long and faceless, fell over me. The purring grew louder. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. I already understood everything. The last thing I saw before the darkness finally consumed me was my reflection in a shard of the mirror on the wall. My own face distorted in a grimace of silent horror, and behind my back, filling the entire doorway, stood that same desiccated figure in rags. And in the depths of its hood, where a face should have been, Two tiny cold points flickered, full of indifferent curiosity for everything that lies beyond the rules. And in the depths of its hood, where a face should have been, two tiny cold points flickered, full of indifferent curiosity for everything that lies beyond the rules. My consciousness blurred. I didn't faint, no. It simply refused to perceive the reality unfolding before me. It was a defense mechanism, a pathetic attempt by my mind to hide from the impossible. I felt the cold emanating from the figure enveloping me, penetrating through my skin, through my muscles, down to my bones. It wasn't the cold of temperature, but the cold of a void, of absolute zero where there is no life, no light, no time. The rustling footsteps resumed. The creature entered the compartment. It didn't step. It seemed to glide in, its rags sliding silently across the floor. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed, a rabbit before a boa constrictor. Only my eyes, frozen in horror, followed the approaching shadow. It stopped a centimeter from me. Long, crooked fingers like dried roots slowly rose and touched my forehead. The touch was light as a cobweb, but a convulsion ran through my entire body. Fragments of memories flashed through my head, but not my own. Alien lives, alien fears, alien final moments. I saw the faces of other passengers, those who, like me, had once broken the rules. I felt their despair, their soul-chilling terror. They were here. All of them. They had become part of this faceless crowd, part of this eternal silent waiting. Then came a voice. But it didn't sound from outside. It arose right inside my head, quiet, without intonation, like the creaking of old wood. You called. We came. You looked. You saw. Now you belong to the void. You have become part of the landscape. I tried to scream mentally, to ask, what do you want from me? But I couldn't even form that thought. The creature was reading me like an open book. We want nothing. We exist. You crossed the boundary. You brought noise into the silence. Now the noise must be absorbed. Such is the law. Not ours. Universal. Its hand gently moved from my forehead to my shoulder, and then I felt myself beginning to change. Not physically, my flesh remained in place. But my eye, my personality, everything that made me Arthur van der Weide, began to dissolve. Fear, pride, memories, desires, all of it was being erased like a drawing on wet glass. It was replaced by a strange, indifferent calm. I stopped being afraid. I stopped wanting. I simply was. The creature turned and glided out of the compartment. Its purring gradually faded in the corridor. The paralysis released me. I slowly rose to my feet. My movements were smooth, alien. I stepped out into the corridor. The carriage was empty. All the doors gaped with black openings. There was no one in the other compartments. No Miller, no other passengers. Only silence. The train was still standing. I walked to a window and pulled back the curtain. The crowd of creatures in rags stood in their place, but now their faceless hoods were turned not towards the train, but towards me, and I looked at them, and in that gaze there was no fear, no disgust. There was only a cold, detached acknowledgement. I understood that they were waiting. I slowly walked down the corridor to the exit. The carriage door was wide open. The steps led down to the dark, flat plain. I descended. The ground under my feet was hard and cold. I took a few steps and turned around. The silver moon stood like a giant toy abandoned in a sandbox. Its windows were dark. Then I turned to face the crowd and walked towards them. They parted, letting me into their ranks. I stood among them. My body assumed the same unnatural, crooked posture. Rags that hadn't been on me a second ago now hung from my shoulders, heavy and dusty. I raised my head and looked ahead into the blackness of the horizon. No thoughts or emotions remained within me. Only one knowledge. The knowledge that we are waiting for the next train. The next arrogant fool who would consider the rules a mere formality. Waiting to remind the universe that even for someone like Arthur van der Weide, there are laws that cannot be bought. The laws of silence. Somewhere in the distance, on the edge of this flat world, a faint, growing whistle sounded. A new train was approaching the boundary, and I, like thousands of others around me, prepared to watch.